Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where the pace slows down, curiosity settles beside you like a calm companion, and science is something we wander through gently rather than race across. Tonight we're easing into a place that many people have seen in photographs but very few have truly imagined at scale. It stretches over thousands of kilometres, supports more species than most cities hold people, and breathes in a way that's almost difficult to grasp until someone explains it. This place isn't made of steel or concrete or anything you'd expect a massive structure to rely on. It's built by countless tiny creatures that don't look like architects at all. And yet they've shaped one of the most remarkable living systems on Earth. We're going to spend time with the Great Barrier Reef, moving slowly through its layers, the way you might explore a familiar neighbourhood, but with enough patience to notice every detail you once overlooked. Before we drift too far, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're near the ocean, maybe you're tucked inland somewhere far from salt air, or maybe you're watching long after midnight when everything has quieted down. Whatever the time or place, I'm glad you're here and ready to settle into this calm stretch of discovery. And if you find this soothing or helpful, I'd be grateful if you tapped like or subscribed. It helps this quiet little corner reach others who want something steady to lean into as they rest. The Great Barrier Reef is often described as enormous, but the scale rarely sinks in. It's more than 2,300 kilometres long, which means if you started at one end and drove along its length at highway speed, you'd be sitting behind the wheel for days. It's not a single ridge or one glowing patch of coral. It's a collection of nearly 3,000 individual reefs and 900 islands. People often imagine a simple underwater ridge, but this is more like a sprawling living district that just happens to be submerged. Fish don't simply visit it. They rely on it, build their routines around it, and live entire generations inside its maze-like structure. If land cities have alleyways and courtyards, then this underwater region has channels, sheltered pockets, and towers built by animals that never intended to create anything close to a skyline. And yet, they did. The surprising part, especially if you're seeing it for the first time in your imagination, is that the entire system rests on the activity of corals. Most people think of corals as colourful rocks, but they're not rocks at all. They're colonies of small animals called polyps. Each one looks almost insignificant on its own, but together, over years and years of steady labour, they build structures that become homes, barriers, nurseries and foundations for so many other forms of life. They work quietly. They don't rush. They simply add layer upon layer of calcium carbonate until their surroundings transform into something sturdy enough for thousands of species to weave their routines around. If that sounds simple, it might help to picture a single polyp. It's tiny, usually just a few millimetres wide, and shaped a little like a small soft cylinder with a ring of tentacles at one end. That small tentacle creature forms a bond with microscopic algae living inside its tissues. Those algae perform photosynthesis, turning sunlight into food. The coral provides a safe place, and the algae give the coral energy in return. That partnership, unfolding thousands of times across thousands of colonies, supports an ecosystem so large that you can see parts of it from space. When you think about that anchoring relationship, it almost becomes surprising how much of the reef depends on small, steady cycles. A bit of sunlight absorbed by algae, a bit of energy passed along to the polyp, a bit of building material added to the colony's growing skeleton, and slowly a home takes shape. The reef doesn't surge into existence. It accumulates without any real sense of hurry. And because it grows this way, everything else around it can settle into predictable patterns. The fish that weave around coral branches know that these structures hold steady. The creatures that hide inside narrow crevices trust that most wolves will still be there tomorrow. Even predators, as intense as some of them can be, rely on the reef's consistency. The arrangement of the coral shapes their patrol routes. The layout guides their movements as reliably as any alleyway or coastline might guide ours. As we move through this exploration, think of the reef not as one single giant object, but as a cluster of interconnected neighbourhoods. Each one has its own rhythm, its own mixture of species, and its own little dramas playing out at different times of the day. When the sun is high, everything looks open and active. Schools of fish carve through the water in coordinated patterns, the way crowds might move through a well-lit plaza. When the light fades, a different shift arrives. Daytime fish tuck themselves into crevices and caves, while nighttime hunters emerge with eyes adapted to low light. What feels like one ecosystem is actually many overlapping routines, each one shaped by the structure beneath it. You might expect something as large as the Great Barrier Reef to feel chaotic or overwhelming, but the closer you look, the more ordered it becomes. Every space has a purpose. The shallow areas near the surface support corals with plenty of sunlight for their algae. Just a bit deeper, things change. The corals look different, grow at different angles, and create habitats suited to creatures that prefer dimmer light. Small fish visit cleaning stations where shrimp and tiny wrasses nibble parasites from their scales. Sea turtles glide through the water with unhurried strokes, stopping to graze on patches of seagrass that grow around the edges of the reef. Rays pass along the sandy flats, stirring up small clouds of sediment as they search for food hidden just beneath the surface. There are so many interactions happening at once that it would be impossible for any viewer, human or otherwise, to track all of them. A parrotfish might be chewing algae from coral branches just meters away, while an octopus tucks itself into a narrow den. Farther down the slope of the reef, sponges host entire micro-communities. Small fish dart in and out, tiny crustaceans scrape the surfaces, worms thread themselves through the layers, creating pathways only they will ever use. None of this seems grand at first glance, but over time it becomes clear that every movement contributes to the larger balance. The reef works because these smallest residents maintain its many surfaces and channels. Without them, the beautiful wide shots people often imagine, those sweeping views of coral gardens and fish-filled caverns, simply wouldn't exist. What makes the Great Barrier Reef especially interesting is the way it acts like a living filter. Water flows through its channels, but slows enough for nutrients to settle into the right places. Some species depend on that current, waiting in open spaces where the flow is steadier, while others prefer sheltered corners where the water moves gently. Crabs bury themselves in sandy soft spots. Sea cucumbers crawl slowly across the floor, processing sediment in quiet, unnoticed routines. They don't rush, they don't compete loudly. They simply continue tasks that matter more than most viewers ever realize. The presence of larger animals shapes the reef in subtle ways too. When a shark cruises past, the smaller fish adjust their paths almost unconsciously. They don't scatter wildly the way cartoons often suggest. Instead, they often shift slowly into more sheltered pockets, returning to open water only when the shark continues on its path. There's a rhythm to their movements that comes from experience rather than panic. Predators aren't constant threats. They're just part of the landscape, influencing how other creatures spend their time without disrupting the entire setting. Another detail that often surprises people is how much seasonal change ripples through the reef. In warmer months, certain types of coral grow faster. Some fish species begin nesting. Turtles return to familiar beaches to lay eggs. Even the water itself changes with temperature shifts and plankton blooms. These changes don't overhaul the reef suddenly. They pass through steadily, like background adjustments that shape the next few weeks of life at every level. Where currents strengthen, certain fish gather to feed on whatever drifts by. Where visibility drops, some species rely more on touch and smell than sight. The reef adapts constantly, though the movements are slow and steady enough that a casual observer might not notice unless they watched over many days. People sometimes assume the reef is fragile in the sense that a single disruption might collapse everything. But the truth is more nuanced. Coral reefs are sensitive, especially to temperature changes and water quality, but they also possess deep resilience. After storms, broken coral branches settle into new positions where they can regrow. Areas damaged by rough waves or passing cyclones often become nurseries for new coral colonies. Fish explore new openings created by fallen structures and quickly make use of them. What appeared broken at first glance becomes an opportunity for rearrangement. That flexibility is part of what allowed the Great Barrier Reef to grow so large over such a long span of time. It doesn't resist change by remaining rigid. It responds by reorganizing itself. At the same time, the reef isn't invincible. Just as with any complex living system, its stability depends on the balance of many factors. Coral bleaching, for instance, occurs when water temperatures rise high enough to stress the coral, causing polyps to expel their algae. Without that partnership, the coral loses energy and becomes pale. If temperatures drop again soon enough, the corals might recover. If not, they can weaken or even die. It's not a sudden collapse, but a gradual struggle that becomes visible in the washed-out colours of large sections of the reef. Yet even this challenge reveals something about how the reef works. Some corals handle heat better than others. Some regions recover faster. Some species move into damaged areas and begin building anew. Though the reef faces real threats, it also holds potential for regrowth when conditions improve. The more you understand its structure and routines, the more you see that the Great Barrier Reef is less like a single organism and more like a community built on countless small agreements. Each species takes on a role shaped by its size, diet, and behaviour. Some clean, some graze, some hunt, some shelter, some drift. Some cling to rocks with quiet persistence. Together they form something that looks almost improbable, until you remember how long it's had to grow and how many generations have contributed to its shape. As we move deeper into this story about the reef and everything living inside it, the scene continues expanding. The next part brings us into the world of the tiny builders responsible for the very foundation of this place, and understanding them helps the rest of the reef make more sense as we move forward through its many layers. If you look at the Great Barrier Reef from above, in one of those wide shots where the ocean shifts from pale turquoise to deeper blue, it's easy to assume that the entire structure is the work of something large. Maybe you picture massive forces shaping it, or geological processes carving out ridges and channels over long stretches of time. That assumption makes sense when you consider the scale. It's enormous and layered and complex. But the truth is almost the opposite. The foundation of everything you see in those sweeping views is built by creatures so small that most people wouldn't give them a second glance if they encountered one on its own. They're not dramatic. They don't march across the seafloor. They don't even look particularly busy. But they are steady, persistent, and collectively capable of shaping a world that holds species ranging from tiny worms to enormous whales. The creatures doing this work are coral polyps. At first glance, they resemble something closer to a delicate sea anemone than an animal responsible for building an entire ecosystem. A polyp is small enough that you could place several of them on a fingernail. Each one has a simple structure, just a soft cylindrical body topped with a ring of tentacles. Inside those tentacles is a mouth, and inside the tissue you'll find algae so small that their presence would go unnoticed unless someone pointed them out under a microscope. Those algae, called zooxanthellae, are the real engines of coral construction. They absorb sunlight and convert it into energy. The polyp gives them a home and the resources they need to survive. They repay the favour with a steady supply of fuel that the coral uses to grow. It's a partnership that doesn't rely on speed or strength. It runs on consistency. What makes this partnership so effective is the way it turns small actions into large consequences. A single polyp cannot build anything recognisable. It can't form a ridge or a cavern or a ledge where fish might hide. But polyps don't live alone. They clone themselves again and again, forming colonies. Dozens become hundreds, hundreds become thousands. Over years, those colonies secrete calcium carbonate, which becomes the hard skeleton that gives coral reefs their structure. The skeleton isn't decorative, it's the permanent record of the colony's slow and steady life. Layer by layer, the coral grows upward or outward, depending on the species. Eventually, those layers become big enough to support fish, sponges, crustaceans, and countless other organisms that depend on solid surfaces for shelter. What's especially interesting is how different species of coral build different shapes. Some grow into broad plate-like structures that spread outward and capture as much light as possible. Others form branching structures that look almost like underwater shrubs or thickets, offering countless hiding places for small fish. Still others grow into massive rounded boulders, dense and heavy, each one formed by thousands of polyps stacking more skeleton on top of the last. The shape depends on the species, the water flow, the depth, and the amount of sunlight available. None of the polyps are planning anything. They respond to the conditions around them, adjusting the way they grow based on the signals they receive. Those branching corals, for instance, thrive in shallow, high-light environments where their vertical growth gives them better access to sunlight. Plate corals spread wider in deeper or more turbid water, where capturing every bit of light becomes more important. Massive boulder corals hold their ground best where waves hit strongest, forming solid structures that don't break easily. Together, these varieties form a patchwork of shapes and textures. When you swim past them, what looks like a single wall of coral is actually the combined work of many different strategies, each one tailored to the conditions at that particular spot. One surprising thing about these small architects is their sensitivity, because the partnership between corals and algae depends so heavily on light and temperature, even small disruptions can cause problems. When water gets too warm for too long, the polyp becomes stressed and ejects the algae. Without them, the coral loses access to the energy it needs. This is why bleached corals look so pale. The colour that usually gives reefs their vibrant appearance comes from the algae. When they're gone, the coral's white skeleton shows through. The coral isn't instantly dead in this state, but it's weakened and running on reserves. If conditions improve, the algae can return. If not, the coral struggles to maintain its usual pace of building. Even so, corals have survived for millions of years. The Great Barrier Reef itself formed after the last ice age, when rising sea levels began covering the continental shelf. As the water stretched farther and farther inland, corals took advantage of the shallow conditions and started building. Some regions grew faster than others, depending on temperature, sunlight, and current patterns. Over thousands of years, these small animals created a structure large enough to influence waves, currents, and entire local climates. The irony is that while we often talk about the reef as a fragile environment, the architects behind it have an incredible ability to persist when conditions allow them even small windows of recovery. A broken coral branch can reattach and grow again. A damaged colony can produce new polyps. Entire sections of reef can regrow over decades if given the chance. To understand how remarkable this is, imagine a single season on the reef. During calm periods of growth, polyps continue building in their usual slow but steady rhythm. They feed at night, extending their tentacles to capture plankton drifting by. During the day, their algae partners take over, gathering sunlight and producing energy. The cycle continues every day with little variation. But then storms pass through, waves hit hard, some coral branches snap, some colonies get covered with sand, some surfaces break open. If this were a rigid structure like a building, the damage might remain forever. But the reef's architects simply continue from whatever foothold remains. A broken branch becomes a new starting point. A shifted skeleton becomes the foundation for new polyps. The reef reorganizes itself around the aftermath the way a city reshapes after minor rearrangements to its streets or neighborhoods. Some coral species take on another role that many people don't expect. When they build in certain patterns, they reduce wave energy. That means the reef acts like a natural buffer for coastlines, protecting them from strong swells. The corals aren't intentionally designing anything, but their presence, shape, and distribution create an effect that stretches far beyond their own small bodies. Even the areas where coral growth slows or stops can shape water movement, guiding currents in ways that help disperse larvae and nutrients. The reef isn't just a home for animals, it's a habitat engineering system built from the combined actions of tiny organisms following simple routines. The relationship between corals and the rest of the reef becomes clearer when you watch how different species interact with them. Parrotfish, for example, scrape algae from coral surfaces using strong beaks. In doing so, they also bite off tiny bits of coral skeleton. This might seem destructive, but it creates sand and clears space for new coral growth. Their activity prevents algae from smothering coral colonies. Without parrotfish, coral would have a harder time competing for space and light. Other grazers play similar roles. Sea urchins, certain snails and small fish nibble algae in ways that keep the coral surface clear. These layers of cooperation and tension give the reef an almost self-maintaining quality. No single species takes control. Everything remains in motion but never drifts too far out of balance, as long as the underlying conditions stay stable enough. When coral polyps reproduce, the scale of their coordination becomes even more surprising. Many species release eggs and sperm into the water simultaneously during specific nights of the year. This mass spawning event is timed by temperature, lunar cycles, and seasonal changes. Seen from a distance, it resembles a gentle underwater snowfall as millions of tiny bundles drift upward. They're not fertilizing individually on the spot. Instead, they rely on the sheer quantity to increase the chances of success. Some of those bundles meet, forming larvae that eventually settle somewhere on the reef and begin the long process of building new colonies. It's one of the few moments when the reef's architects aren't acting quietly. They act on a scale big enough to shift the appearance of entire regions of water. Despite this impressive burst of activity, coral larvae are incredibly vulnerable. Most never find a suitable place to settle. They drift, become food for other animals, or end up in areas where they cannot survive. But the ones that do succeed and anchor themselves to rock or dead coral skeleton eventually become the seed of a new colony. Given enough time, that colony grows large enough to contribute to the reef structure in visible ways. A ridge forms here, a shelf appears there. The slow and persistent work continues without any central direction, shaping an environment that benefits from its layered growth. The idea that such a vast system depends on organisms so small you could miss them entirely might feel strange at first. But the more you understand the reef's layout, the more logical it becomes. Large animals often rely on the stability and complexity created by smaller species. Coral reefs simply take this principle to an extreme. Instead of a single keystone species, there are thousands of small contributors working simultaneously. The reef grows not because of sweeping changes, but because of countless small decisions happening every second. A polyp extends its tentacles to feed. A tiny piece of calcium carbonate is added. Another layer is formed. A new branch or plate begins to take shape. Over years, these increments become visible forms. Over centuries, they become geological features. Over millennia, they become the Great Barrier Reef. Even the colour of the reef comes from the partnership between coral and algae. Different algae produce different pigments. Some give off browns or greens. Others cause corals to appear bright blue or fluorescent. Some species of coral produce proteins that glow under certain types of light. These aren't meant to attract anything. They simply happen to be the result of chemical interactions inside the tissue. The reef's bright appearance, which people often associate with vibrancy and energy, is really the result of countless small, quiet processes happening in unison. The texture of the reef also reflects the varied growth habits of different coral species. Some parts feel like rough stone. Others are smoother, shaped by the way colonies grow alongside one another. Sponges grow in between coral structures, adding their own surfaces and internal spaces to the environment. Shellfish attach themselves to coral skeletons. Worms dig into them. Algae cover areas where coral has died. Every one of these additions and changes helps define how water flows, how fish move, and where small creatures find their homes. All of these interactions, building efforts and steady rhythms, form the foundation for the rest of the reef's complexity. As we drift forward into the next part of this journey, the scene will widen again. The next layer reveals how the reef's shifting conditions and daily cycles give rise to something that feels less like a static structure and more like a city that adjusts its mood depending on light, temperature, and the movements of the creatures within it. When you look at the reef from a distance, whether through a mask underwater or in a photograph, it can seem like a place that doesn't change very much. The corals stay where they are. The ridges and curves look stable. Fish swim through the same routes day after day. But the closer you get, the more you notice that the entire environment behaves differently, depending on the time of day, the strength of the currents, the temperature, and even the way clouds move overhead. What appears still at first glance turns out to be full of steady shifts that reshape the way animals behave and how the reef carries itself. These shifts aren't dramatic in the way storms or tidal waves are dramatic. They're subtle, steady, and continuous, more like the difference between morning in a busy city and the moment just before the streetlights come on at dusk. Nothing is random, and nothing is static. As sunlight hits the water in the early hours of the day, the reef begins moving through its routines. Light changes the behaviour of almost every species that relies on vision, and that includes a huge portion of reef life. Some fish emerge from their night shelters and begin swimming in loose groups again. They're not waking up the way mammals do. They simply switch behaviours when the level of light reaches a point that signals it's time to feed or travel. Some hunt only during the hours when visibility is high enough for them to track prey. Others avoid those hours entirely and hide inside narrow cracks where their colours blend into the shadows. The moment daylight spreads across the reef, the entire community adjusts in ways that would be easy to miss if you weren't watching closely. Corals themselves also respond to the change in light. Many reef-building corals feed primarily at night, extending their tentacles to catch drifting plankton and then retract them when daylight returns. When the first rays reach the reef, these tentacles start to pull inward, leaving behind the smooth surfaces and ridges of the coral skeleton. This isn't a dramatic motion. It's slow and almost unnoticeable if you're not looking carefully. But it changes the appearance of the entire coral surface. At night, many colonies seem almost fuzzy because of their extended tentacles. During the day, they take on a more sculpted look. This simple shift, happening across countless colonies at once, transforms the reef into something that feels more open and orderly. The visibility also changes dramatically with the angle of the sun. In the morning, as light filters through the surface, shadows stretch across the coral formations at longer angles. Fish swim in and out of these shadows with an awareness shaped by experience. Predators take advantage of low-angle light because it helps them stay hidden. Prey species use the same shadows to avoid detection. It's not a tense environment in the way people often imagine the natural world. It's more like a quiet exchange of attention as animals read their surroundings and react according to patterns they've followed for generations. As the day moves toward midday, colours across the reef appear clearer. Corals with bright pigments look more vivid. Fish with reflective scales shimmer more noticeably. Some parts of the reef take on an almost glassy appearance as sunlight penetrates straight down, revealing structures that were harder to see during the softer morning hours. With this clarity, grazing fish become more active, picking algae off rocks, coral skeletons and patches of substrate. Herbivores work steadily, moving along with small nibbles that keep algae from growing too thick. Without these daily grazing routines, algae would quickly overtake many regions of the reef. The amount that grazers remove in a single day is more than most people would expect. They don't do it with urgency. They simply maintain a pace that has been part of the reef's stability for as long as these species have existed here. Predators also adjust their behaviour as the day gets brighter. Some take advantage of the increased visibility to track schools of fish more efficiently. Others retreat to deeper or more shaded areas where they can remain less visible. Sharks, for example, don't need bright light to navigate, so they often move with the same calm confidence regardless of the time of day, but the fish around them adjust based on how easy it is to see approaching movement. Even small changes in light guide larger patterns of motion. Dense schools tighten their formation, not because they're afraid, but because the risk of being spotted is higher when the water is well lit. The reef's soundscape changes too. though it's much more subtle than anything you'd hear on land. Underwater microphones placed around reefs pick up a steady chorus of clicking, crackling and snapping, mostly from small creatures like snapping shrimp and fish, communicating through short bursts of noise. During the day, when more species are active, this chorus grows louder. It's not a chaotic noise, it's a patterned backdrop that helps young fish locate healthy reef habitat. In fact, some fish larvae use the reef's sound to navigate through open water. They drift for days or weeks after hatching and eventually swim toward the crackling sound that signals a stable, functioning reef. If the reef is quiet, it often means something is wrong, perhaps fewer organisms are active or conditions have changed. But during normal daylight hours, the reef produces a busy but predictable acoustic signature. Currents also contribute to the reef's shifting moods. Water flow varies throughout the day as tides rise and fall, and these changes influence where nutrients collect. In stronger currents, plankton concentrate in specific areas. Fish that filter feed gather in those spots, waiting for the constant flow of small organisms. When currents slow, these feeders move to different areas where food settles more slowly. The corals benefit from these patterns as well. When the current is strong enough, it brings a steady supply of oxygen and nutrients past the coral surfaces. When it slows, sediments may settle on the corals, prompting some species to use small pulses of water or mucus coatings to clear their surfaces and maintain access to light. As the afternoon progresses, the reefs subtly shift again. Some fish begin returning to their preferred nighttime shelters earlier than others. It's not based on a precise hour. It depends more on the direction of light, the behavior of predators, and the gradual cooling of the surface water. Certain species, like butterfly fish, remain active until the last bits of daylight fade. Others, such as damselfish, start settling into their protective crevices a little earlier. Their movements during this time are more purposeful, as though they're making sure they reach safety before the next shift in the reef's routine begins. The reef's colours also change as the sun lowers. Without the bright overhead light, corals appear softer in tone, blues deepen, greens become more muted, orange and pink pigments look slightly warmer. Fish that were highly visible during midday become harder to spot as the dim light softens sharp contrasts. Even the water itself looks different, taking on a slightly darker hue as particles and plankton become more prominent in the fading light. The small animals that rise from the deeper layers of the ocean begin drifting upward, drawn by the safety that comes with lower visibility. These planktonic migrations happen every day and are among the largest mass movements of life on the planet, though they happen quietly and without fanfare. As evening approaches, the mood shifts in another direction. Fish that spent the day out in the open move into sheltered spaces, forming clusters around branches, caves and ledges. Some species hover close to the openings of their hideouts, while others tuck themselves fully inside. Their colours may appear more muted in the fading light, but their behaviour becomes more deliberate. They slow down, conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary motion. At the same time, nocturnal animals begin to appear. Some of them were hidden only a short distance away, waiting for the moment when their natural advantages, better night vision, specialised hunting techniques, or the element of surprise, become useful. The shift between day and night on the reef isn't a dramatic event. It's a steady, organised transition. Corals once again extend their tentacles. Fish with heightened sensitivity to low light begin scanning for movement. Predators that hunt using smell or electrical signals become more active. Even the smallest creatures, such as worms, snails, and tiny crustaceans, behave differently once the balance of light and shadow changes. These adjustments create a second version of the reef that looks almost unrelated to the one seen during the day, though the structure is exactly the same. Night on the reef looks calm to a casual observer, but every part of the environment is busy in its own quiet way. Corals feed more actively. Sponge species filter greater volumes of water. Crabs search for food in small, careful movements. Octopuses leave their dens to explore nearby patches of sand and rock, using their arms to investigate hidden areas. Larger predators like moray eels swim with slow precision, relying on scent more than sight. Sharks patrol routes they know well, guided by senses that don't depend on sunlight. The calmness at night isn't caused by inactivity. It comes from the way animals move with purpose. Because so many species rely on darkness for either protection or success in hunting, they conserve their energy and avoid unnecessary movement. Their motions are deliberate, quiet, and steady. As a result, the reef appears to shift from a busy daytime scene to a slower, more measured rhythm. But the level of activity when summed across all species remains high. The reef also feels different at night because the direction of attention changes. During the day, fish and other creatures rely heavily on sight, which means movement is more obvious. At night, animals rely on scent, vibration, sound, and even electrical signals. These senses shape their movement patterns in ways that look calmer, even though the level of awareness is just as intense. A predator may drift along the water column with barely any visible movement, following chemical cues. A crustacean might march confidently across the sand, unbothered by the darkness, because its attention is tuned to scent trails rather than light. Another shift at night comes from the presence of bioluminescent plankton. Not every part of the reef experiences this, but in certain conditions, tiny drifting organisms can emit brief glimmers when disturbed. These flashes aren't meant to entertain anyone. They're biological reactions triggered by motion in the water. To a viewer, they look like faint sparks scattered through the darkness, but to the organisms that produce them, they're part of a survival strategy. Sometimes the glow distracts predators. Sometimes it attracts larger predators that might chase the smaller ones away. Either way, the plankton's glow becomes part of the reef's nighttime atmosphere. As the night continues, temperature shifts slightly. The water cools by a small but meaningful amount, affecting the metabolism of reef organisms. Some species become more active in cooler conditions, while others slow down. Many corals rely heavily on nighttime feeding to gather nutrients they can't get from their algae partners. Their tentacles, which stayed hidden for much of the day, remain extended as they capture small drifting organisms drawn upward by the darkness. This nighttime feeding also influences the creatures living around the coral. Fish that avoid open areas during the day venture out slightly farther. Not far, but enough to look for small bits of drifting food. Cleaner organisms remain active in some regions, picking parasites or dead tissue from larger fish that approach patiently, trusting these small helpers even in the dark. All of these patterns work together to maintain a balance that carries into the early hours of the next day. As morning begins again, the cycle continues smoothly. The reef shifts once more. Daytime fish reappear. Nocturnal species retreat. Corals pull their tentacles back inside. The slowly warming water changes the activity of plankton. The entire scene resets with new light, and the reef returns to the version of itself most people imagine when they think of coral ecosystems. These shifting behaviours, routines and adjustments define the reef far more than any single moment does. Instead of thinking of the reef as a fixed structure, it makes more sense to see it as a place shaped by steady transitions. Every shift in light, temperature and current leads to another set of behaviours. Those behaviours work together to maintain the reef's stability, guide the lives of the species that depend on it, and create the foundation for the next part of our journey, where we'll look at the animals that rely on glowing pigments, chemical cues, and specialised abilities to navigate the reef's constantly changing environment. If you spend enough time watching the reef, especially in the areas where the sunlight begins to soften as it moves through the water, you start noticing details that don't look like anything you'd expect from the usual bright coral scenery. Colours appear that don't seem to match the light around them. Shapes that looked simple from afar take on an unexpected glow when you're close enough. It's not dramatic like neon signs or the exaggerated colours people sometimes imagine. It's quieter than that, more like catching a reflection that shouldn't be possible at the angle you're viewing it. Many creatures on the reef interact with light in ways that don't fit with ordinary expectations. They absorb it, manipulate it, and use it for purposes that only really make sense when you understand the routines they follow. Corals themselves often produce subtle, glowing pigments. These proteins don't glow for decorative purposes, and they don't work like lights in a dark room. Instead, they absorb high-energy light and emit lower-energy light, usually in greens, oranges, or reds. Some researchers think these pigments act as a kind of sunscreen for the coral's algae partners, protecting them from intense sunlight. Others think they help guide light deeper into the tissue where the algae can use it more effectively. What's clear is that the glowing effect becomes most noticeable when the surrounding light is dimmer, such as early morning or late afternoon. Under certain conditions, even a human observer can see patches of coral glowing softly. It's not a theatrical effect, it's just chemistry working as intended. This glow also influences the animals living nearby. Fish with reflective scales often look more noticeable in these conditions. Many species have pigments, or structural colours that respond differently to increasing or decreasing light. Their scales don't glow on their own. They reflect specific wavelengths in ways that appear brighter when the surrounding environment dims. These subtle reflections play a role in communication, camouflage, and sometimes mating displays. A fish that looks ordinary at midday might appear to shimmer faintly during the transition hours when sunlight filters through the surface at low angles. Some fish have even more specialized adaptations. Certain species of flashlight fish store light-producing bacteria under their eyes. The bacteria emit a soft glow that the fish can cover or reveal using a flap of skin. They use these patches of light to communicate with others of their kind, and possibly to confuse predators. The glow isn't strong enough to illuminate large areas of the reef, but in the darker portions of the water column it becomes noticeable. When groups of flashlight fish swim together, they can create patterns of blinking points that move along the reef at night. The purpose of this coordinated blinking isn't fully understood, but it appears to help them remain together in conditions where visibility is low. Other species use bioluminescence in more direct ways. Some small crustaceans release glowing chemicals when frightened, creating temporary light trails that confuse predators. These chemicals drift through the water before fading, leaving behind a faint trail of light. This gives the crustacean a chance to escape, while the predator is momentarily distracted. It's not a strategy designed for beauty or spectacle. It's a simple survival tactic shaped by the environment. There are also planktonic organisms drifting through the water column that emit brief flashes when disturbed. These flashes aren't meant to communicate anything. They're triggered by movement, pressure changes, or contact with other organisms. When a fish swims through an area dense with these glowing plankton, its movement can leave faint trails behind it. This effect is usually only visible at night or during low light conditions, but it contributes to the sense that the reef has its own internal lighting system. In reality, each small glow is a chemical reaction happening inside individual organisms. Some fish species, especially those that patrol the deeper sections of the reef, rely on glowing pigments and structural coloration to blend into their environment rather than stand out. Blue and green reflective pigments help them disappear against the dim background. A fish might look bright when held in sunlight, but become nearly invisible when positioned above a coral ledge where only filtered light reaches. This skill is crucial in the narrow balance between hunting and avoiding being hunted. A slight shift in angle can reveal or conceal an entire body. One of the most intriguing light-related adaptations on the reef belongs to creatures like mantis shrimp. They don't produce glow in the usual sense, but they perceive light in ways that most animals cannot. Their eyes can detect ultraviolet light and multiple types of polarized light. This means they see patterns on fish, corals, and other shrimp that appear blank to the human eye. Many corals have ultraviolet patterns that aren't visible to most viewers. Fish with what looks like a single colour often carry hidden markings that only species with specialised vision can interpret. These patterns might help individuals recognise each other, choose mates, or identify rivals. In a reef environment with so many overlapping species and habitats, seeing what others can't becomes an advantage. Some fish also reflect ultraviolet light as part of their coloration. To most predators, these fish look plain, but to members of their own species they appear marked with clear patterns. Researchers believe this helps them communicate without drawing attention from larger animals that lack UV perception. The reef contains many examples of communication built around differences in vision and light sensitivity. Glowing pigments, reflective scales, and ultraviolet markings all contribute to an environment where visibility isn't just about what light is present, but about how each species interprets it. At certain depths where sunlight becomes diffuse, some organisms rely on fluorescence for camouflage. It might sound counterintuitive. You'd think glowing would make an animal easy to spot, but fluorescence can actually make the creature match the ambient light conditions more closely. For example, some fish absorb blue light from the water and release green light, making them blend more closely with their surroundings. This reduces their contrast and helps them appear less noticeable from a distance. Some algae species also fluoresce under certain conditions. Their glow isn't related to communication or defense. It's simply a byproduct of the chemical processes they use to handle sunlight. Yet the effect contributes to the overall light environment in small but meaningful ways. When you have thousands of organisms absorbing and re-emitting light at slightly different wavelengths, the reef becomes a mosaic of subtle influence rather than a uniform field of colour. Glowing behaviours aren't limited to fish and corals. Certain worms, small jelly-like organisms and free-floating larvae also produce light. Some release glowing mucus to distract predators. Others flash when touched. Some glow faintly at all times in deeper water where hardly any other light penetrates. Even though these creatures are small, their presence becomes part of the reef's overall appearance during low-light hours. A diver or researcher might see tiny spots of light drifting in the distance and not realise they're watching dozens of organisms performing small defensive routines. One of the most surprising observations is how many species use fluorescence to help them find food. Predatory fish sometimes scan coral branches with specialised vision that picks up glowing patterns on prey species. Some crustaceans reflect certain wavelengths in ways that make them easier to spot for animals with the right visual adaptations. When you think about the reef from this perspective, glowing isn't just something that happens by coincidence. It's part of an entire communication system built on light. Even creatures that don't produce or manipulate light directly still depend on these patterns. Octopuses, for instance, use their highly adaptable eyes to interpret faint differences in light and colour. They don't glow at all, but they respond to glowing species around them when hunting or hiding. Their vision helps them locate prey that emits subtle signals invisible to other predators. And because octopuses can change their own skin texture and colour, they adjust their appearance in response to the surrounding light environment. They blend in with fluorescent corals just as easily as with dark rock, altering their camouflage to match the shifting light. Crabs and lobsters also interact with glowing organisms, though in more indirect ways. Some species choose hiding spots based on how light filters through coral structures. They may position themselves in areas where they appear less visible due to the ambient glow. They aren't controlling light, but they're reading it carefully enough to avoid attracting attention. Sea anemones contain fluorescent proteins similar to those found in corals, sometimes creating a soft glow along their tentacles. This glow doesn't advertise anything to humans, but to fish that form symbiotic relationships with anemones, these patterns may help them locate specific individuals or distinguish between species. Some juvenile fish settle into anemones only if the tentacles reflect certain wavelengths. This shows just how precisely light guides the interactions among reef species. In certain conditions, especially after long stretches of calm weather, the water around the reef becomes clear enough for glowing patterns to appear more intense. During these times, the contrast between different species increases. Fish that usually look muted take on sharper outlines. Corals with fluorescent pigments become more noticeable. Even the sand on the seafloor can reflect faint traces of glowing particles. These distinctions help organisms make decisions about movement, feeding, and shelter. The presence of glowing organisms also affects how predators behave during transitional hours. Some species, like certain groupers, detect fluorescent signals to locate small prey hiding in the coral. Instead of searching blindly, they rely on light cues. When the light fades too much, they switch to different strategies or retreat to their own nighttime shelters. Their ability to act effectively depends on how the reef's glowing organisms shift with the changing light. The idea that the reef glows may give the impression of a dramatic scene, but the reality is more subtle. The glow doesn't overwhelm the environment. It exists as part of the ordinary functioning of thousands of species, each using light in a slightly different way. Together, these behaviours shape the reef's character at different times of day. They're not meant to create a spectacle. They're simply the result of biological processes adapted to the conditions of a place where sunlight slowly loses strength as it pushes through water. Understanding this collection of glowing behaviours helps make sense of the creatures that become active when the light begins to dim. Their routines depend on the shifting colours and brightness of their surroundings. As we continue on this path through the reef, the next section will lead us into the spaces tucked between coral branches and around sheltered corners, where hidden corridors support entire layers of life that don't always appear in the obvious open scenes. When most people picture a coral reef, they imagine the open areas first, the bright patches of coral, the fish weaving through sunlight, and the wide spaces where everything is easy to see. But so much of the reef's activity happens in places where the light barely reaches, where the space narrows, and where movement shifts from sweeping arcs to small, careful adjustments. The hidden corridors of the reef, those tight spaces inside coral branches, small caves, cracks in limestone, and sheltered pockets between structures, hold a dense community of creatures that rarely appear in photographs or wide-angle views. These areas are quieter, more controlled, and filled with animals that rely on precision rather than speed. When you move close to a coral structure and begin looking between the branches, patterns start appearing that you might miss from even a short distance away. There are small fish that spend almost their entire lives inside a single coral colony. They feed there, nest there, and retreat deeper into the branches whenever something disturbs the water. They aren't nervous in the way humans interpret nervousness. Their bodies are simply suited for these narrow passages, and venturing out into open water would expose them to predators that rely on the element of surprise. By staying inside these tight spaces, they gain both shelter and predictable access to small food sources carried in by gentle water flow. Some of these small residents include species like gobies and damsel fish. Gobies in particular excel at navigating tight corridors. Their streamlined bodies, small fins, and ability to cling to surfaces make them almost perfectly suited for life in cramped environments. They can stay motionless for long stretches, observing what's happening around them with precise attention. When they do move, it's usually a quick dart between 2 points rather than extended cruising. Their motion is efficient because energy is valuable in places where food doesn't drift through as frequently as it does in open areas. Damselfish, on the other hand, often maintain small gardens of algae within sheltered regions of the reef. They defend these patches from other herbivores and chase away intruders with surprising determination for their size. Their gardens provide a consistent food source, and they maintain them with quiet persistence. These small behaviours contribute to the health of the surrounding coral by limiting algae overgrowth. What might look like minor territorial behaviour becomes part of a larger system in which many species share the responsibility of keeping coral surfaces clear enough for healthy growth. Hidden corridors also provide shelter for creatures that would otherwise struggle in the open. Small shrimp species, including cleaner shrimp, live deep within crevices where they interact with fish that come seeking help removing parasites. The shrimp itself is quite small, but its role in the corridor is significant. Fish arrive, hover patiently, and allow the shrimp to move across their bodies. Even large predatory fish participate in these visits, trusting the shrimp despite its tiny size. These interactions happen quietly in sheltered corners, far from the more visible scenes of the reef. Some corridors support species that specialize in scavenging. Small crabs and hermit crabs navigate the uneven floor of the reef's inner layers, picking through bits of organic material that collect in sheltered pockets. These corridors act almost like natural funnels where water carries debris that settles into small drifts. Crabs take advantage of this predictable supply, moving through the spaces with deliberate steps. Their claws sort through particles without disrupting the surrounding area. Their presence matters because they help keep these hidden passages from accumulating excessive organic material, which would otherwise interfere with coral growth or oxygen levels. Sponges also dominate many of the shaded areas inside the reef's corridors. They filter vast amounts of water, even in low-light conditions. Their bodies contain narrow channels that pull in water, extract bacteria and small particles, and then release clean water back into the surroundings. Even though they remain stationary, sponges influence the water quality inside narrow reef corridors in measurable ways. Their filtering activity helps maintain oxygen levels and clarity in spaces with reduced flow. This creates conditions suitable for worms, tiny crustaceans, and other animals that rely on stable environments. Sea cucumbers contribute to the maintenance of the seafloor inside these hidden areas. They move slowly along sandy pockets, ingesting sediment and processing it internally. Their movements leave behind cleaner, more oxygenated sand. This activity may appear insignificant, but it plays a major role in preventing the buildup of decomposing organic matter. Without these gentle sediment cleaners, some of the reef's narrow spaces would become stagnant. Instead, they remain functional, supporting a diverse range of organisms that depend on healthy sand for burrowing or feeding. One of the most overlooked residents of these corridors is the brittle star. These relatives of starfish hide deep inside cracks and extend their long arms outward to catch food particles drifting by. They position themselves at angles that maximize access to the flow while keeping their central bodies protected. Their arms move in steady, coordinated motions that look almost mechanical. This feeding strategy helps them gather food without exposing themselves. When danger approaches, the arms retract quickly, pulling the brittle star safely inside its hiding place. Entire populations of brittle stars exist inside coral structures, without ever appearing in the bright outer scenes that people associate with reefs. Crinoids, sometimes called feather stars, also inhabit sheltered areas. They cling to coral surfaces and filter the water with their feathery arms. The intricate structure of their limbs allows them to capture small organisms drifting through these narrow corridors. They don't move fast, but they can swim short distances when necessary using coordinated motions of their arms. Their presence adds a layer of functional diversity to these hidden spaces. Some of the corridors also house organisms that specialize in long-term residence. Worms, for example, build tubes or burrows inside the reef skeleton. These structures become microhabitats for other species. The worms extend feathery structures outside their burrows to feed on particles carried by water flow. The tubes also stabilize small areas of sediment and create spaces where tiny crustaceans and microorganisms can live. These worms contribute to the structural strength of the reef by binding loose materials into more stable formations. Among the residents of these narrow spaces, there are also small predators. Certain species of moray eel prefer the shelter of tight corridors and caves. They use these spaces as bases from which to hunt. Their long bodies allow them to navigate the interior of the reef with ease, slipping between rocks and coral branches. They remain motionless for long stretches, blending with their surroundings. When prey passes by, they strike with precision. Their hunting method depends on the stability and complexity of the corridor environment. Without these sheltered spaces, moray eels would not be able to hunt as effectively. Small octopuses also favour the privacy of hidden reef passages. They tuck themselves into holes, carefully rearranging shells or bits of debris at the entrance. These small collections act as both camouflage and a subtle barrier. When the octopus emerges to explore, it does so with deliberate movements. It may venture only a short distance before returning to safety. The structure of the corridor shapes its behaviour. Because octopuses rely on touch, smell and texture as much as sight, these tight environments offer a controlled setting where they can navigate with confidence. The structure of these hidden passages also influences the flow of nutrients. Water moving through the reef slows when it encounters narrow openings, allowing suspended particles to settle into small piles. This settling effect creates microzones rich in food for species that feed on detritus. Because the water moves differently in each part of a corridor, different species occupy slightly different positions based on their needs. Some prefer the faster flow near the entrance. Others choose deeper pockets where food collects more effectively. This layered use of space allows many species to coexist without competing directly. The corridors also act as nursery spaces for animals too small or too vulnerable to survive in open water. Juvenile fish dart through these protected areas, learning the layout of their surroundings before venturing farther out. They develop their swimming precision here, adjusting to the unpredictable water movements that ricochet through narrow spaces. These areas allow them to feed in safety and observe the behaviours of older fish that occasionally pass through. The reef depends on these safe corridors to raise the next generation of its many residents. Some species deposit their eggs in these protected spaces. Snails attach their egg capsules to the walls of small caves. Crabs hide their eggs in pockets of rock or coral. Even some fish species lay eggs on the surfaces inside narrow crevices. These eggs are protected not by elaborate defences but by the simple fact that predators have difficulty reaching them. The structure of the corridor itself becomes the barrier. At night, the corridors become even more active. Animals that hide during the day move out in slow, cautious patterns. Worms extend, feeding appendages farther. Crustaceans explore new corners. Small fish adjust their positions to take advantage of changed light levels. Because many predators hunt in the open at night, these sheltered spaces become temporary centres of activity for nocturnal species. The coral surface, which may have appeared empty during the day, becomes a network of coordinated movements under low light. Corals themselves influence these corridors by modifying the shape of the spaces over time. As colonies grow, dead sections form new openings while living sections expand and close others. The architecture of these hidden areas is always shifting at a pace too slow for the casual observer to notice. Over months or years, however, a space that once sheltered certain species may become too cramped as coral skeletons expand. New openings may emerge, changing the flow of water and creating opportunities for different species to move in. This constant reshaping is part of what keeps the reef dynamic. Even the smallest structural changes influence how life arranges itself. The reef's hidden corridors also reveal something important about predator-prey relationships. Unlike the open water, where chases happen in broad arcs, the interactions inside narrow spaces depend on strategy rather than speed. A small predator might wait near a junction where water carries food. A shrimp might choose a spot where predators cannot reach easily. Prey species learn the angles and corners where they can escape. These small decisions shape the balance of the corridor ecosystem. Some of these interactions are cooperative. Cleaner wrasses and shrimp set up cleaning stations in sheltered areas because fish feel safer entering a narrow space where predators cannot easily follow. The structure supports both the cleaner species and the visiting fish. These visits remove parasites and dead tissue, improving the health of the reef's residents. These cleaning sites become regular stops in daily routines, forming a network of reliable locations where fish return again and again. While these corridors hold many species permanently, others use them only temporarily. Juvenile fish, certain invertebrates, and some migratory species stay in sheltered areas during vulnerable stages before moving to different parts of the reef. Their presence is brief but essential. The reef functions in layers. Temporary residents take advantage of safety and stability. Long-term residents maintain the environment through grazing, cleaning, or filtering. Together they create a balanced system that remains steady despite constant change. The hidden corridors might seem minor compared to the bright open areas, but they're the framework that supports the reef's complexity. Without these internal spaces, the reef would lose its depth. Species would have fewer places to hide, fewer opportunities to feed safely, and fewer chances to complete their life cycles. These corridors hold the quieter routines that make the reef resilient. As we continue through this journey, the next part leads into the transition between these sheltered areas and the wider scene at nightfall, where many creatures leave their daytime hideouts and the reef transforms again into a new set of patterns and movements. When the sun begins to lower over the Great Barrier Reef, the whole environment enters a gradual shift that carries more weight than most people expect. Nothing changes suddenly. There's no single moment when day ends and night begins. Instead, the reef eases into its evening routine through small adjustments that start long before darkness arrives. Fish begin modifying their behaviour as soon as the angle of sunlight changes, corals prepare for nighttime feeding, and countless small invertebrates begin moving from deeper hiding spots toward the open water. This transition, though gentle in appearance, sets the stage for a different version of the reef, one that operates according to rules not always visible during the day. As the light softens, animals that spent the day exposed in bright areas begin withdrawing into shaded places. These movements aren't frantic or rushed. They happen with a steady confidence that comes from instinct and repetition. Day-active fish like butterfly fish, tangs, and parrotfish move between coral heads with clear intention, moving closer to the places where they'll spend the night. Many of them return to the same shelter every evening, relying on familiar surroundings where they can avoid predators that hunt in dim light. They don't choose hiding places randomly. Their decisions are influenced by the size of openings, the shape of coral branches, the presence of other fish, and the patterns of water flow that might reveal or conceal their silhouettes. This movement back to shelter is one of the most noticeable early signs of the reef's transformation. Some species hover just outside their chosen crevice for a moment, scanning the water around them. They adjust their position slightly depending on the behaviour of nearby fish. Once they feel secure, they slip into their hiding spot and remain there with only minor fin movements. Some species change their colouring as they settle in. Daytime patterns fade into quieter nighttime tones that help them blend into the shadows. A fish that looked bright and active only minutes before now appears muted and still. At the same time, corals begin preparing for the return of their nocturnal feeding strategy. During the day, most reef-building corals keep their tentacles retracted because they rely heavily on their symbiotic algae for food production. But as the light fades, they start to extend soft, delicate structures to catch plankton drifting by. This process happens gradually. First, small bumps appear on the coral surface, then the tentacles unfurl slightly and finally they extend fully into the water. When this occurs across thousands of coral heads, the reef's surface transforms from a ridged stone-like texture into a much softer appearance. These feeding structures sway with the movement of the water, creating an entirely different landscape from the one seen earlier in the day. As corals prepare for feeding, plankton begin rising from deeper waters. This vertical migration is one of the largest daily movements of life on Earth, even though the organisms involved are tiny. During the day, plankton remain deeper in the water column to avoid predators that rely on sight, but as the light decreases, they drift upward in search of food and safety. Their ascent changes the dynamics of the reef noticeably. Fish that feed on plankton become more active. Filter feeders like certain species of corals, sea fans and tube worms extend structures to capture the drifting particles. Many small predators also adjust their routines to take advantage of the increased availability of prey. These early shifts set the stage for the next part of the transformation, when nocturnal species begin emerging from their daytime shelters. Many of these animals remain completely hidden while the sun is out. Some hide inside coral structures, others burrow in sand, and some tuck themselves into caves in the reef. They are not resting in the sense that people rest. They simply avoid activity during the day because their senses and strategies are best suited for low-light conditions. As the reef darkens, these species begin appearing one by one. Small crustaceans such as crabs and amphipods move across the reef surface to search for food. They do this with measured steps, pausing often to assess their surroundings. With fewer visually oriented predators active at night, their chances of encountering danger shift. The creatures that hunt them after dark use different strategies: smell, vibration detection, or specialized vision. So the crustaceans adjust their behaviors accordingly. They move quickly across open patches of sand or rock, then slow down when they reach areas with more cover. Worms, which spent most of the day hidden in burrows or tubes, extend feeding structures into the water. Some species filter particles, while others graze on microbial films that grow across the reef. Their presence during this time adds a layer of constant motion along the seafloor and coral branches. Even though each individual worm is small, their combined activity helps maintain the reef surfaces by consuming algae, bacteria, and detritus. Octopuses become more active as darkness spreads. Many species prefer hunting at night when they can rely on their sense of touch, smell, and texture recognition more than sight. An octopus doesn't need bright light to navigate. It glides along the reef with slow, careful movements, testing surfaces with its arms, opening and closing small crevices to see what might be hiding inside. Their hunting is usually methodical rather than fast. They approach openings with caution, insert an arm, and react immediately to even the slightest motion inside. Their behaviour contributes to the nighttime rhythm of the reef, not with dramatic chases, but with slow, deliberate exploration. Other nocturnal predators include different species of moray eels. They spend the day coiled inside narrow holes, often with only their heads exposed. At night they move more freely, weaving through coral passages with confidence. Their hunting relies heavily on their sense of smell and the ability to detect faint disturbances. They don't need to see prey clearly. They simply follow the signals carried by water movement until they reach the source. Their presence in the corridors and open areas shapes the behaviour of many smaller species that must remain alert in their proximity. The mellow glow from bioluminescent plankton becomes more obvious as the night deepens. When disturbed, these tiny organisms emit faint flashes. They aren't designed to illuminate anything. They are chemical reactions triggered by movement. A passing fish might create a brief trail of light behind it. Even a soft current can cause small flickers. To observers with artificial lights, the effect may be faint. But in natural darkness, especially on calm nights, it adds a subtle visual layer to the reef's transformation. Some fish species that remain active at night rely on sensory systems most people don't think about. Cardinalfish, for example, have eyes adapted to low light. They gather in groups near coral heads, moving slowly and feeding on plankton drifting by. Others, like squirrelfish, prefer the edges of the reef where shadows create clear boundaries. They navigate with steady movements, pausing often before making decisions about direction. Their behaviour is shaped by the balance between the desire for food and the need to remain hidden from predators like moray eels and reef sharks. Sharks, particularly smaller reef-associated species, become more visible at night. They patrol territories with controlled, rhythmic swimming, relying less on sight and more on senses that detect electrical fields and movement. They don't race through the water. Their speed is consistent and measured. They follow paths that they repeat nearly every night, checking familiar hunting zones where prey tend to gather. Their presence influences the movements of fish that remain active in the open water. Rays glide gently across the sandy bottom in search of small invertebrates. With each wing-like motion, they stir small clouds of sediment that settle slowly behind them. Their movements do not disrupt the reef significantly, but they play an important role in the sand's rotation and the distribution of buried organisms. Their hunting method is simple. They detect faint signatures of life beneath the sand, then use gentle pressure to uncover crabs, worms, and small mollusks. Sea cucumbers and other detritus feeders become more active during these hours as well. They sense fewer threats at night, which allows them to move into slightly more exposed areas. Their feeding contributes to nutrient recycling by processing sediment and cleaning patches of sand that accumulate organic matter. The changes in the reef soundscape at night are subtle but noticeable. Some snapping shrimp continue their clicking, but the pattern becomes more spread out. Many fish species communicate differently at night, producing low-frequency signals that travel well through darkness. These sounds help them maintain group cohesion or navigate toward familiar shelter. As the darkness deepens, the reef becomes a network of non-visual signals. Electrical cues, chemical trails, gentle touches, and pressure waves guide the movements of animals that rely less on sight. This shift makes the nighttime reef a completely different sensory environment. A creature that feels almost blind during the day may become perfectly capable in low-light conditions. Others that excel in daylight become vulnerable or inactive at night. This balance allows so many species to share the same space, without interfering with one another too much. Many nocturnal species remain active only until the middle of the night, after which they rest or reduce movement. Others continue until the earliest hints of dawn. The overall pattern depends on temperature, moonlight, tides, and the presence of predators. On nights with strong moonlight, some animals hide more deeply. On darker nights, others take advantage of lower visibility to travel farther from their shelter. As the hours pass, the reef gradually prepares once again for the next transition. The earliest hint of dawn is not the sun itself, but a subtle change in the quality of darkness. Water begins to reflect faint light from the horizon long before the sun appears. Some fish detect these changes even when they are still barely noticeable. They begin shifting their patterns back toward daytime behavior. Nocturnal predators retreat into their hiding places. Corals slowly retract their feeding structures. Plankton begins sinking back into deeper waters. The reef resets itself through another series of small, careful adjustments. The nightfall transformation shows how many species depend on routines governed by light rather than fixed schedules. It reveals how much life remains hidden when only daytime scenes are considered. And it prepares the way for understanding another essential layer of the reef, the microscopic organisms that quietly influence the entire system despite their size, shaping water chemistry, feeding cycles, and nutrient flow in ways that affect every visible creature around them, as the story continues deeper into the unseen foundations of the Great Barrier Reef. When most people think of the reef, their attention naturally goes to the animals large enough to notice with the naked eye. The fish with bright patterns, the corals that form visible structures, the turtles gliding past in slow arcs, the rays moving across the sand. These are the creatures we imagine first because they're familiar enough to identify, and they occupy the spaces we can easily observe. But much of what makes the Great Barrier Reef function is driven by organisms so small that entire populations of them could exist on a single fingertip without being seen. These microscopic kingdoms form the foundation for everything around them. They influence water clarity, control nutrient cycles, guide the survival of countless species, and act in ways that determine how healthy or stressed the reef becomes. Even though each microscopic organism is almost impossibly small, together they shape the world on a scale that rivals the coral structures themselves. They drift, settle, divide, feed, and multiply in quantities so vast that the water surrounding the reef is essentially a living mixture. These organisms don't behave randomly. They follow patterns shaped by light, currents, temperature, and chemical signals. Their presence affects every visible creature on the reef, even if those creatures never directly interact with them. One of the most essential groups in this microscopic domain is phytoplankton. These tiny photosynthetic organisms drift near the surface, absorbing sunlight and converting it into energy. They form the base of the reef's food web. Every fish species, no matter how large or specialized, ultimately depends on the energy phytoplankton produce. Some animals consume the phytoplankton directly. Others eat the organisms that feed on them. Even predators at the highest levels rely on the nutrients originally generated by these microscopic plants. Phytoplankton populations fluctuate with light and temperature. On bright days, they grow quickly, dividing and multiplying in a matter of hours. When conditions shift, perhaps due to cloud cover, water movement, or changes in nutrient availability, their growth slows. These variations influence the clarity of the water, the availability of food for filter feeders, and even the behavior of fish that rely on plankton-rich currents. When phytoplankton bloom, they can create hazy conditions that reduce visibility. When their numbers drop, the water becomes clearer. This constant rise and fall gives the reef its dynamic nature, and helps explain why no 2 days look exactly alike. Zooplankton form another critical part of this domain. These small drifting animals include larvae of fish, crustaceans, mollusks, worms, and many other reef species. Some zooplankton remain microscopic throughout their lives. Others grow into the larger animals people recognize. Their presence in the water column determines when many fish species feed. During the day they remain deep, but at night they rise in tremendous numbers to feed near the surface. This daily vertical migration shapes much of the reef's nighttime activity. It provides food for nocturnal fish, corals, and filter feeders. It also influences the movement patterns of predators that track the concentration of prey, rather than relying on vision. These drifting organisms do more than provide food. They help transfer nutrients between different layers of the ocean. When zooplankton feed at the surface and then sink as waste or through natural movement, they bring organic material downward. This distribution helps maintain nutrient balance across the reef. Without these constant transfers, certain areas would become nutrient poor while others became overloaded. The balance maintained by zooplankton supports coral growth, algae populations, and the health of countless microorganisms living within the reef structures. Another essential microscopic population includes the bacteria living throughout the reef. These microorganisms occupy nearly every surface. They live on coral skeletons, inside sponge tissues, on algae, within the mucus layer covering many fish, and even inside the digestive systems of larger organisms. Bacteria break down organic matter that would otherwise accumulate and disrupt the ecosystem. When bits of dead plant or animal material drift into small crevices, bacteria consume it, turning it into nutrients that corals and algae can use. This recycling process keeps the reef from becoming clogged with debris. Some bacteria form symbiotic relationships with larger organisms. For example, many fish rely on bacteria in their guts to break down algae, detritus, or small plankton that they otherwise couldn't digest. Certain corals depend on bacterial communities to protect them from harmful microbes. These beneficial bacteria form a protective barrier, occupying the same surfaces that harmful bacteria might invade. When the balance among these microscopic populations is stable, the coral benefits from a natural defense system. Algae also exist in microscopic forms beyond the symbiotic partners inside coral tissues. Free-living algae cling to rock surfaces, settle on sand grains, and grow on the outer layers of dead coral. These algae produce oxygen, help stabilize loose surfaces, and provide food for herbivores. Some species of algae form thin films that are almost invisible until viewed closely. These films are consumed by grazing fish and invertebrates, which rely on them for essential nutrients. The grazing helps prevent algae from overwhelming the reef and outcompeting corals for space and light. Certain microscopic algae also contribute to a process known as nitrogen fixation. They convert nitrogen in the water into forms other organisms can use. This process helps maintain the nutrient balance in reef waters supporting coral growth and plankton populations. Without nitrogen-fixing microorganisms, the reef would struggle to sustain the diversity of life that depends on these nutrients. Sponges play a major role in connecting microscopic communities with larger animals. Their porous bodies host huge numbers of bacteria and other microorganisms. These microbes process nitrogen, carbon, and other nutrients. The sponge pumps water through its body, filtering out bacteria, plankton, and organic particles. Much of what they filter is consumed by the sponge's microbial residents. The sponge then releases water enriched with nutrients that other reef organisms need. This exchange helps support coral growth and plankton populations. The sponge acts almost like a nutrient processing station, linking the microscopic and visible parts of the reef. Virus-like particles also exist in staggering numbers. While viruses often carry negative associations, on the reef, they play a natural role in controlling plankton populations and recycling nutrients. When viruses infect microscopic organisms, they cause those organisms to break apart, releasing organic material into the water. This material becomes food for bacteria and small grazers. The cycle may sound destructive, but it's part of the natural balance that keeps nutrients circulating. Larval forms of larger animals also contribute to the microscopic kingdoms. Coral larvae drift among phytoplankton and zooplankton during the early stages of their lives. Fish larvae navigate using chemical cues given off by microbial communities near healthy reefs. Crustacean larvae feed on tiny plankton before settling on the reef floor. These early life stages rely heavily on microscopic food sources. Without abundant microscopic organisms, the next generation of reef animals would struggle to survive long enough to grow. Some of the smallest residents interact with the reef chemically rather than visually. Cyanobacteria, for example, produce oxygen through photosynthesis. This oxygen helps balance the levels necessary for both corals and fish. They also produce substances that support the growth of certain algae and suppress others. Their presence can either stabilize or destabilize parts of the reef depending on conditions. When kept in balance, they contribute positively. When allowed to grow unchecked, they can disrupt coral populations. The interactions among these microorganisms are driven not by conscious behavior, but by natural cycles. They respond to temperature changes, light availability, and nutrient levels. When temperatures rise, some bacterial populations grow faster, shifting the balance of microscopic life. This can place stress on corals and other organisms. When temperatures fall, different microbes become more dominant. These shifts ripple upward through the food web. A slight change in microbial communities can affect plankton populations, which then influences fish behavior, coral health, and predator movement. In healthy conditions, the reef supports a stable combination of many microscopic species. Corals maintain their relationship with their symbiotic algae. Bacteria protect coral surfaces from harmful microbes. Plankton populations rise and fall with predictable patterns tied to daily light cycles. Sponges filter water effectively. Algae films grow just enough to feed herbivores without overwhelming the corals. Everything works in a consistent rhythm. When conditions shift too suddenly, however, microscopic communities can become unbalanced. For example, if excess nutrients enter the water from runoff, certain algae can grow too quickly. This growth reduces oxygen levels and blocks light from reaching corals. Similarly, if temperatures rise for extended periods, the algae inside corals may become stressed and leave. Without their microscopic partners, corals become vulnerable. Bacterial communities may also shift, allowing harmful species to take hold. These changes occur at scales invisible to the human eye, yet they influence every visible part of the reef. Understanding these microscopic interactions helps make sense of how the reef maintains itself. The coral structures, fish populations, and invertebrate communities depend on stable nutrient cycles. These cycles exist because millions of microscopic organisms perform their roles without pause. They break down waste, produce oxygen, process nitrogen, and provide food for larger creatures. They respond immediately to environmental changes, providing early indicators of stress before the larger animals show signs of difficulty. Through these microscopic layers, the reef becomes a connected system rather than a collection of isolated species. Every visible creature, from the smallest fish to the largest shark, relies on processes happening at scales too small to see. The reef's health depends on these constant quiet exchanges that go unnoticed but never stop. These invisible kingdoms shape how the reef moves through day and night. Their rhythms guide the behavior of the fish waking at dawn, the corals feeding at dusk, and the creatures rising from the depths at night. They set the foundation for interactions among larger species and influence how each part of the reef responds to environmental changes. As we continue following this story deeper into the reef structure, the next part reveals how the predators in this environment use colour, vibration, scent, and precise movements to navigate the shifting patterns created by both the visible and microscopic world surrounding them. Predators on the Great Barrier Reef don't fit the typical image most people imagine when they think about hunting in the natural world. There aren't many chaotic chases, bursts of splashing violence, or rapid explosions of movement that define hunting scenes on land. Here, most predators rely on precision, patience, and the ability to blend so completely into their surroundings that prey often doesn't know they're nearby until the very last moment. Many of these animals hunt not with speed but with silence, and they use colour in ways that aren't always obvious until you understand how different species perceive their environment. Their strategies depend on calm timing, subtle movements, and the same light-filtering conditions that shape the reef's daily rhythms. At first glance, the reef at midday doesn't look like a place where predators dominate. Everything appears too open and too colourful for stealth to work. But predators here have adapted to operate within these conditions. They use the reef's complex structure, light patterns, and shifting shadows to their advantage. They don't need to chase prey over long distances. Instead, they focus on short-distance precision, where a perfectly timed movement, combined with camouflage, gives them the upper hand. One of the clearest examples of this strategy can be seen in the behaviour of lionfish. Their bodies are covered in long, thin spines that spread outward like an elaborate frame. These spines don't serve as a disguise in the traditional sense, but they break up the silhouette of the fish when viewed against coral structures. To many prey species, especially small fish with limited depth perception in complex habitats, a lionfish doesn't immediately look like a predator. It looks like a cluster of thin, stationary shapes. The lionfish moves slowly, barely disturbing the water around it. When it approaches a small fish, it doesn't chase. Instead, it flares its fins wide, creating a barrier that channels the prey into a preferred angle. With a sudden forward movement, the lionfish strikes. The speed is quick only in the final instant. Everything leading up to it is measured and silent. Stonefish take camouflage even further. They sit motionless on the seafloor, blending so thoroughly with rocks or coral rubble that even experienced divers often overlook them. Their rough skin mimics the texture of the surrounding environment. Colours match subtle variations in the reef's surfaces, from muted browns to scattered patches of algae-like greens. Stonefish don't stalk prey. They wait, their mouths open with startling speed, creating a vacuum that pulls small fish or crustaceans inside before the prey has time to react. Because stonefish rarely move, they avoid drawing attention. Their silence is one of their most effective tools, allowing them to conserve energy and ambush prey with minimal effort. Another predator that relies heavily on stillness is the wobbegong shark. These sharks rest on the seafloor or drift into shaded areas between coral formations. Their skin is patterned with mottled shapes that mimic the coral and rock around them. When viewed from above, they look like part of the reef's texture rather than a living animal. Wobbegongs are patient hunters. They wait for fish to pass within reach before striking. Their camouflage is so effective that even fish swimming close by often do not recognize them as a threat. When they do strike, It happens quickly enough that the prey has no chance to escape. The reef's behaviour changes at night, and many nocturnal predators use patterns of light and colour differently. Some species depend on the faint glimmers produced by bioluminescent plankton to locate prey. Others rely on their ability to remain completely invisible in low-light conditions. Cardinal fish, for example, use their large eyes to detect movement in near darkness, while predators like moray eels use scent and water displacement more than vision. These senses allow them to navigate with precision, even when the reef appears pitch black to a human observer. One of the most interesting nocturnal predators is the cone snail. While it may not look like a predator at first, the cone snail uses a specialised harpoon-like tooth to capture small fish. The movement of this tooth is incredibly fast. The snail releases a chemical into the water that slows the prey's swimming. Then, with a sudden strike, the harpoon delivers venom that immobilises the fish almost instantly. The snail doesn't need to move quickly. Its strength lies in chemical control and rapid precision at the moment of attack. The reef's predators also rely heavily on colour. Not vibrant displays, but subtle contrasts and patterns adapted to their vision and the vision of their prey. Many fish cannot see the full range of colours that humans can. Some perceive ultraviolet markings that remain invisible to us. Others detect contrast better than hue. This means a predator doesn't need to match the coral's exact colour. It only needs to break the outline of its body in a way that disrupts the prey's ability to detect movement or shape. Scorpionfish demonstrate this behaviour particularly well. They rest on coral or rocky surfaces, adjusting their colours slightly over time to match their surroundings. Their bodies aren't uniformly coloured. Instead, they display irregular patterns of spots, patches, and faint stripes. These patterns mimic the scattered textures of algae, coral fragments, and encrusting organisms. When a small fish approaches, the scorpionfish remains completely still. Their eyes track movement without revealing their position. When the prey drifts close enough, the scorpionfish opens its mouth in a rapid forward lunge, creating a sudden pressure change that pulls the prey in. Octopuses also rely heavily on colour, though their approach is more flexible. With specialised skin cells, they can change their colour, texture, and even reflectivity in a fraction of a second. This ability allows them to blend into virtually any surface on the reef. An octopus can match the smooth surface of a rock, the rough exterior of a coral head, or the shifting patterns of sand. Their camouflage is not just visual. It changes based on the texture they mimic. Tiny muscles in their skin create bumps or smooth patches. This adaptability makes them effective hunters in both daylight and darkness. When hunting crustaceans or small fish, they often move silently along the reef floor, only revealing themselves when they extend an arm into a crevice to search for prey. Reef sharks take a different approach. They don't rely on camouflage to the same extent. Instead, they combine smooth, continuous movement with acute senses that allow them to track prey through electrical fields and vibrations. A shark can detect the faint electrical signals produced by muscle activity. Even a small fish hiding under sand or within coral structures sends out signals that a shark can interpret. Their movement is steady and controlled. They conserve energy by gliding rather than constantly beating their tail. Their silence helps them detect shifts in water pressure that prey create when they move, allowing the shark to adjust its direction with precision. Barracuda use a blend of stealth and sudden speed. They often remain still, hovering in mid-water with minimal fin movement. Their long, slender bodies reflect light in patterns that make them harder to distinguish from the shimmering surface above. By aligning themselves with the angle of sunlight, they minimize shadows and blend into the background. When they decide to strike, they accelerate rapidly, covering short distances in a single burst. Their success depends not on long chases but on perfect timing combined with the prey's difficulty in detecting them. Colour also plays a major role in the strategies used by cleaner shrimp and cleaner fish. While they aren't predators in the traditional sense, they use bright colours to signal their role in removing parasites from fish. Their patterns stand out, making it clear to larger fish that they are not a threat. In this way, colour becomes a protective mechanism. Predatory fish approach cleaning stations calmly, allowing these small creatures to move across their bodies. This behaviour highlights how colour isn't always used for deception or stealth. Sometimes it communicates safety and defines boundaries that predators respect. One of the most fascinating uses of colour among predators comes from species like the peacock mantis shrimp. Although they don't rely on stealth in the usual sense, they use light differently from almost any other reef species. Their eyes can see polarized light, ultraviolet reflections, and detailed patterns invisible to many other animals. They use this advanced vision to locate prey hidden in crevices or camouflaged against coral. Their hunting strategy revolves around powerful strikes delivered with specialized appendages. These strikes are so fast that they create small pressure bursts capable of stunning or killing prey instantly. Their vision gives them the precision needed to strike exactly where they need to, even in dimly lit or cluttered conditions. Their colours, though vibrant, don't disadvantage them because most of their prey cannot perceive the full spectrum they display. Camouflage on the reef often extends beyond colour. The shape and posture of a predator can break its silhouette enough to go unnoticed. Leaf scorpion fish sway gently in the water, mimicking floating debris or bits of algae. Frogfish imitate sponges or coral lumps, remaining motionless for long stretches. Some even attract prey by using a small lure that resembles a drifting worm or tiny shrimp. The prey approaches, thinking it's found an easy meal, only to discover too late that the lure is attached to a predator waiting with its mouth already prepared to strike. Even predators like sea snakes, which move more visibly than many fish, rely on a combination of silence and careful movement. They glide through coral channels with minimal disturbance. Their slender bodies allow them to navigate narrow spaces where fish hide. They use their sense of smell and ability to detect chemicals in the water to locate prey. Their success depends on approaching quietly and striking quickly before prey can react. Colour also plays a role in helping predators avoid being detected by their own competitors. Some species adjust their patterns slightly to reduce the risk of attracting larger predators. A muted pattern might help a mid-sized predator avoid the attention of larger sharks. These subtle variations show how colour is part of a layered communication system where species must balance visibility to prey with invisibility to their own threats. The reef structure creates countless opportunities for silent hunting. Narrow corridors, crevices, overhangs, and small caves provide pathways that predators learn throughout their lives. Experienced hunters know which routes offer the best angles for ambush. They avoid wasteful movements, they conserve energy. Their knowledge of the reef becomes as important as their senses, because success depends on approaching prey through areas where escape paths are limited. The influence of microscopic organisms also shapes predator behaviour. Plankton-rich water attracts small fish, which then attract larger predators. The movement of plankton at night draws fish into open areas, where predators like reef sharks and large jacks track them. The subtle glow of bioluminescent plankton can reveal the motion of prey to predators with adapted vision. Each layer of the ecosystem influences the next, creating conditions where silence, patience, and the ability to interpret faint cues determine who succeeds and who remains hidden. As we move deeper into the story of the reef, the presence of predators that rely on silence and colour reveals how tightly interconnected every part of the environment is. Their routines link the visible and microscopic levels of the ecosystem. Their hunting strategies reflect the reef structure, the flow of water, and the behaviours of countless smaller creatures. These interactions set the stage for one of the most remarkable events the reef experiences. Not the hunt, but a large-scale biological process that appears briefly and transforms the reef into a place filled with drifting life as the next part leads into the season when the reef releases new beginnings into the ocean. Once you've spent enough time watching how the reef behaves from day to day, you start to realise that every part of its routine is shaped by rhythm. Light changes behaviour, temperature changes behaviour, currents guide movement. Each species follows predictable cues shaped by the slow rise and fall of these forces. But once a year, the reef steps out of its ordinary routines and carries out one of the most coordinated biological events on the planet. It doesn't happen with noise or dramatic displays. It happens in near-perfect silence, triggered by signals that only the reef's residents can interpret reliably. This moment is the annual mass spawning, when corals release millions of eggs and sperm into the water, creating a scene that gives the reef a completely different appearance for a short period of time. Nothing in this event resembles the steady, cautious feeding or moving behaviours that define most of the reef's life. Corals that spend the majority of their year anchored in place suddenly participate in a synchronised release that relies on cooperation across countless colonies, species, and structures. Each coral colony acts on cues related to temperature, daylight length, the phase of the moon, and chemical signals floating in the water. These cues guide the exact timing so that most corals in a given region release their reproductive cells on the same night. It's a method that increases the chances that eggs and sperm will meet successfully, simply because there are so many of them in the water at once. In the hours leading up to the event, the reef looks no different than usual. Corals extend their feeding tentacles at night as they always do. Fish drift in and out of their nighttime shelters. Plankton rise from deeper areas. The reef's nighttime routine unfolds as it does every other night of the year. There's no visible preparation or build-up, but inside the coral tissues, small bundles containing eggs and sperm move toward the surface of the colony, gathering in discrete pockets. These bundles develop slowly over the previous weeks, and their readiness depends on the right environmental cues lining up. Once everything reaches the correct conditions, the corals release them. When the moment arrives, it doesn't feel sudden to the corals themselves. It's simply the result of many cycles aligning. But to an observer who's never witnessed it, the release appears unexpected. Tiny coloured bundles begin detaching from the corals and floating upward toward the surface. Each bundle is small, often just a few millimetres in size, but when thousands of colonies release these bundles within the same window of time, the water fills with drifting particles that rise toward the surface like a slow-motion snowfall in reverse. The colours vary depending on the species. Some release pinkish bundles, others release orange, pale yellow or white. The combined effect makes the water appear filled with suspended beads of light, especially when viewed from below with even a faint glow from the moon or stars. These bundles float upward because they're slightly buoyant. They reach the surface and begin breaking apart. Eggs and sperm separate and mix with those from other colonies of the same species. This mixing increases genetic diversity, helping corals maintain resilience against environmental changes. The entire process is silent. There are no movements from the corals that you can see. The bundles simply detach and begin their journey upward. The scene is calm, even though what's happening represents the creation of millions of potential new coral colonies. Fish respond to this event immediately. Many species recognize the scent and movement of the drifting bundles. Some fish, especially plankton-eating species, move toward the surface to feed. The sudden abundance of nutrient-rich particles creates a feeding opportunity that only occurs once a year. Fish swim through the drifting bundles with steady, deliberate movements. They don't disrupt the event entirely. There are too many bundles for them to consume, but their presence becomes part of the scene. Even nocturnal predators sometimes rise from deeper areas to feed on the scattering particles. Other animals react in different ways. Crabs and small crustaceans emerge from crevices to consume the bundles that become trapped against coral branches or settle into small pockets. These creatures move quickly and carefully, picking through the clusters that gather in sheltered spots. Their feeding behaviours help prevent too much organic matter from collecting in narrow areas, which benefits the reef in the days after the spawning event. The spawning doesn't happen all at once across the entire reef. It occurs in waves, different species have slightly different timings. Some release their bundles early in the evening, others do so later, sometimes after midnight. These variations help avoid cross-species interference, since eggs and sperm can only successfully meet within the same species. The waves also prevent any single area of the reef from becoming overwhelmed by too much organic material at once. Even though each species follows its own timetable, the alignment among thousands of colonies within that species is remarkable. They release their bundles within a window of minutes to hours, guided by cues that remain reliable year after year. The phase of the moon plays a major role. Most coral species spawn after a full moon, when the nights are still bright enough for navigation, but the tidal forces are at the right stage to help disperse the drifting larvae in the following days. Water temperature is also crucial. If the temperature hasn't stabilised within a certain range, the corals will delay spawning until conditions improve. Once the bundles reach the surface and break apart, fertilisation begins. Sperm cells move toward eggs in the surrounding water. Successful fertilisation produces embryos that begin dividing almost immediately. These early life forms float among the surface currents for several days. They develop into larvae that drift with the plankton, moving in ways they cannot control. They're caught in surface currents, rising and sinking based on density changes, and feeding on microscopic organisms when needed. Their survival depends on avoiding predators and finding a suitable place to settle once they have developed enough. While these larvae drift, they respond to chemical cues released by healthy reefs below. These cues guide them toward areas where corals are already thriving. Some larvae find a suitable place to settle within a few days. Others drift for weeks before finding the right combination of surfaces, light levels, and chemical signals. When a larva finds a good spot, it attaches itself and begins the slow process of becoming a polyp. That polyp eventually clones itself to form a small colony. Over time, if conditions remain stable, that colony contributes to the reef's growth. What makes this entire process remarkable is that it relies on coordination rather than competition. The corals release massive numbers of eggs and sperm not to overwhelm the environment, but to increase the chances that even a small percentage will survive. Many eggs and larvae will be consumed by fish, jelly-like organisms, or other plankton feeders. Others will drift too far from suitable settlement areas, but enough will survive each year to maintain the reef structure over generations. The mass spawning isn't limited to corals. Many other species time their reproductive events around the same periods. Some worms release their gametes into the water in similarly coordinated bursts. Certain fish species choose this same window to spawn, using the abundance of drifting material as protection for their eggs or larvae. The reef becomes a place where countless reproductive strategies overlap, each influenced by the signals that corals and other organisms release into the water. During this season, the water near the surface becomes cloudy with organic material. The drifting particles move with the current, creating streaks and clusters that shift silently as the night continues. Some areas of the reef experience heavy concentrations of spawning activity, while others see only faint traces. This variation depends on the density of coral colonies, the direction of currents, and the timing of each species' release. The presence of so much organic matter has additional effects. Microorganisms respond to the increased availability of nutrients by reproducing more rapidly. Some bacteria break down particles that sink toward the seafloor. Others form temporary blooms that support the growth of small grazers. These reactions help keep the water balanced in the days after the event. The reef's microscopic communities, which operate constantly throughout the year, take on an even more active role during this time, processing the sudden influx of organic material. Fish continue feeding on leftover bundles for several days. Their movements during this period are influenced more by drifting particles than by the usual patterns of plankton. Schools of fish gather in areas where the concentration of eggs and larvae is highest. Some species protect the developing embryos that they've produced, while others take advantage of the temporary abundance for energy before returning to their typical feeding routines. Even after the visible portion of the event ends, the effects continue in quieter ways. The larvae drifting in the water begin forming new generations of coral. Some will settle near their parent colonies. Others will travel to new areas and help expand the reef. This spread is one of the major reasons the Great Barrier Reef can regenerate after disturbances. When conditions are right, new colonies can take hold and begin slowly rebuilding damaged sections. The steady arrival of new coral larvae each year ensures that the reef has a constant supply of potential new growth. The mass spawning is one of the few times when the reef's typically hidden reproductive processes become visible. Most animals reproduce in ways that leave very little trace. Fish release eggs that drift for a short time before disappearing into the water column. Crustaceans carry eggs beneath their shells until the larvae hatch. Worms and other invertebrates release gametes into the water in brief pulses that may go unnoticed unless someone is watching carefully. But the coral spawning event brings these processes into the open. It transforms the reef from a collection of quiet routines into a place temporarily filled with drifting life. Once the waves of spawning settle, the reef gradually returns to its usual appearance. The suspended particles thin out as they drift away or are consumed. The fish return to their typical routines. Corals retract their feeding tentacles. Plankton resume their daily rise and fall based on light conditions. The reef moves into the next phase of its seasonal cycle. This reproductive event may last only a short time, but its impact stretches across months and even years. It supports the reef's ability to recover from storms, temperature changes, and natural disturbances. It ensures that new generations continue to build the structures that define the reef, and it marks one of the clearest demonstrations of how tightly connected every part of the reef is, from the smallest microorganisms to the largest coral colonies. As this story continues, the next part shifts toward the challenges the reef faces from the environment around it, particularly during the periods when storms, temperature changes, and unpredictable conditions test the stability of the structures built over centuries. When you think of the reef, the first images that probably come to mind are the calm days. Clear water, steady sunlight, fish drifting between coral branches, everything moving at a pace that feels predictable. But the Great Barrier Reef does not spend its whole life under gentle skies. It exists in a region where storms pass with real force, where waves rise high enough to push coral branches aside, where currents surge so strongly that entire sections of the reef experience sudden rearrangements. These storms are not unusual interruptions. They are part of the reef's long-term routine, shaping it in cycles that have unfolded for thousands of years. And the reef has developed a set of quiet responses that allow it to endure these events with more resilience than many people expect. Long before a storm reaches the reef, the first signs appear in the water itself. Currents begin shifting. The surface becomes uneven. Light penetrates the water differently, scattering as the surface chops. Many fish respond to these cues as soon as the changes begin. Schools tighten. Certain species move closer to the shelter of coral outcrops. Larger fish adjust their routes, swimming deeper or closer to areas with more structure. None of this is frantic. It's simply behavior shaped by experience. For creatures that spend their entire lives on the reef, the early signals of rough weather are part of their everyday awareness. As the storm moves closer, waves begin pushing water into the shallower sections. Corals near the surface feel the force first. Branching corals bend with the movement. Plate corals shift slightly as currents flow across them. Some animals retreat deeper into the reef's interior spaces. Others remain in their usual spots but change how they move. Many daytime fish remain hidden, letting the water carry debris and sand past them while they stay in place. The reef doesn't panic, it braces. When the storm arrives, the energy released into the water is immense. Waves strike the surface and send pressure pulses downward. In shallow areas, these forces can break coral branches, shift loose rubble, and alter the position of large coral heads. The water becomes cloudy with sediments brought up from the sea floor. Pieces of dead coral skeleton swirl through the water column. For a human observer, it would look chaotic. But for the reef, This is a known pattern. Storms have passed here for millennia, and every part of the ecosystem has developed routines for handling the disruption. Some corals are more vulnerable to storm damage, particularly branching species that grow quickly but have more delicate structures. Their thin branches can snap in high-energy waves. At first glance, this might seem harmful, but broken fragments often settle onto stable surfaces where they can reattach and continue growing. This ability to regenerate from fragments has allowed many coral species to spread across wide areas. What looks like destruction becomes, in the long term, part of their strategy for expansion. A single broken branch carried by currents can become the starting point for a new colony. Massive corals, such as large boulder-shaped colonies, withstand storms differently. Their weight and compact shape make them far more resistant to breakage. Instead of snapping, they may shift slightly or lose small patches of living tissue if debris collides with them. But the colony remains structurally intact. Over time, the exposed areas heal as new polyps grow and spread across the damaged surface. These boulder corals act as anchors for the reef's stability, surviving events that might topple more fragile structures. Sponges and soft corals also play a role in weathering storms. Many of them compress or flex with the movement of water, reducing damage to their bodies. Their ability to bend prevents them from breaking. After the storm, they continue filtering the water, which becomes especially important once sediments settle into small pockets across the reef. Their filtering helps clear suspended particles and restore clarity. Fish respond with their own patterns of resilience. Species that rely on hiding spots retreat deeper into crevices. Their knowledge of the reef structure helps them avoid the worst turbulence. Larger fish move into deeper water where the force of the storm is less intense. Even pelagic species that occasionally pass near the reef adjust their routes to avoid the roughest surface conditions. When the storm finally passes, these fish emerge gradually, assessing how the environment has changed. For many animals, the period immediately after a storm is as important as the storm itself. The water remains murky with debris. Sand settles unevenly, covering some areas and exposing others. Small pockets of rubble pile up in new locations. Broken coral fragments lie scattered across the seafloor. Some animals begin inspecting these new formations almost immediately. Crabs walk across the rearranged substrate, searching for food trapped among the debris. Herbivorous fish move between patches, feeding on algae that become more accessible as the storm clears away competing growth. Small worms and microorganisms begin colonizing the fresh surfaces exposed by broken coral. These early shifts set the stage for a longer period of recovery. Coral fragments that remain in suitable positions anchor themselves within weeks or months. The broken surfaces of larger corals become opportunities for new polyps to grow. Small invertebrates settle into the fresh openings. Algae grow across newly available surfaces, creating food for grazing species. The reef reorganizes itself through these steady adaptive actions. Storms also influence the reef's chemistry. When waves churn the water, oxygen levels increase near the surface. This oxygen-rich water mixes with deeper layers, helping support the metabolic needs of many organisms. Debris from broken surfaces releases nutrients that microorganisms quickly process. These nutrients feed plankton, which in turn become food for filter feeders. The cycle of breaking and rebuilding, unsettling and reorganizing, keeps the reef active and productive. The resilience of coral comes not only from its ability to regrow, but also from the diversity of forms found across the reef. Some coral species grow quickly but break easily. Others grow slowly but endure storms with minimal damage. The combination allows the reef to recover through multiple strategies. Fast-growing species repopulate damaged areas quickly, while massive corals provide long-term stability. Even if a storm damages one part extensively, other sections remain intact and serve as sources for new growth. Different depths also experience storms differently. Shallow areas take the brunt of the impact. Deeper regions feel far less force because the energy of waves dissipates with depth. Corals in these deeper locations remain stable, even during powerful cyclones. After the storm, these deeper corals release larvae during spawning seasons that drift into shallower damaged areas and help rebuild them over time. This vertical layering is a natural safety system, ensuring that not all coral faces the same risks at once. The way storms rearrange the reef also creates opportunities for species that prefer specific conditions. Some fish seek open sandy areas that appear after sediment shifts. Others thrive in newly formed rubble zones where hiding places become more abundant. Certain algae settle quickly on surfaces exposed by storms, providing food for species that rely on fresh growth. These movements become part of the reef's long-term cycles, influenced not by stability alone but by the alternation of damage and recovery. Even the presence of large marine animals contributes to post-storm adjustment. Sea turtles often return to reefs after storms to forage on algae growing on newly exposed surfaces. Their grazing helps prevent algae from overtaking recovering coral. Rays search through disturbed sand beds, stirring up hidden organisms. Sharks patrol areas where fish gather in the aftermath to feed on debris. Their movements influence how smaller fish distribute themselves during this period. The reef's relationship with storms isn't purely physical. Temperature changes associated with seasonal patterns can also stress corals. Unlike the short, intense force of storms, temperature stress builds slowly. When water becomes too warm for extended periods, corals begin to lose their symbiotic algae, resulting in bleaching. This condition weakens the coral and makes recovery more difficult. The absence of algae deprives corals of their main energy source during the day. If temperatures drop soon enough, the symbiotic algae can return. But if warm conditions persist, corals face an uphill struggle. The reef's resilience is tested most strongly when storms follow periods of temperature stress. Bleached corals are more vulnerable to physical damage. If a storm strikes before corals have recovered, breakage is more severe. Still, even in these challenging circumstances, some corals endure. Certain species tolerate heat better. Some manage to retain enough energy to survive until conditions improve. Their recovery may be slow, but it continues as long as they can maintain even a small portion of their living tissue. The microorganisms living on the reef also help during times of stress. Helpful bacteria protect coral surfaces from harmful microbes that become more active when corals weaken. Sponges process nutrients more efficiently when sediments settle unevenly. Plankton populations adjust to shifts in temperature and nutrient levels. These microscopic responses form the backbone of the reef's ability to endure fluctuations beyond storms alone. Over long spans of time, the reef's appearance changes because of the combined effects of storms, temperature shifts, and natural cycles. Some areas grow taller, others flatten. Some sections become dominated by fast-growing branching corals, while others become fields of massive corals resistant to strong waves. The reef isn't a static structure, it evolves according to the pressures around it. Its resilience comes from this flexibility. Instead of resisting change entirely, it adapts through thousands of small responses. Fish populations shift too. Species that prefer calm, sheltered spaces move into new crevices formed by storms. Species that rely on open water move into areas where coral has not yet regrown. Predators adjust their strategies based on new terrain. The reef's food web reorganizes itself without losing its overall balance. In the months following a major storm, the reef often looks very different. Broken coral skeletons may lie scattered across the seafloor. Large areas may appear bare, but slow growth fills in gaps. Coral fragments that survived begin forming new branches. Algae cover exposed surfaces. Invertebrates settle into small pockets. Fish return to territories they abandoned temporarily. The reef rebuilds itself through thousands of tiny decisions made by its inhabitants. If you were to revisit the same part of the reef years later, you might find it hard to recognize. The layout would be different. Coral structures would have grown taller or spread outward. New species might occupy the area. Others may have moved on. But what you would see is not random. It's the result of cycles that the reef has followed for thousands of years. Storms shape it. Recovery reshapes it. Life continues moving through these patterns with steady determination. The reef's resilience is not about avoiding damage. It's about the ability to rebuild, reattach, regrow, and reorganize. Its strength lies in diversity, complexity, and steady adaptation. These qualities have allowed it to survive long periods of environmental change, even as the world around it shifts. As this story continues through the structure of the reef, the next part turns toward its connection with time itself. Coral skeletons hold records of past conditions. Layers of growth reveal the reef's long history, shaped by calm years, violent storms, ancient climate cycles, and slow geological changes that have guided it toward the present day. If you spend long enough watching the reef from day to day, it can be easy to forget how old it really is. The fish, the corals, the shifting sand, the passing shadows created by clouds overhead, everything feels immediate, like a place defined entirely by what is happening right now. But the Great Barrier Reef is more than a collection of present-day behaviours. Its entire structure carries the memory of conditions that existed long before anyone alive today was here to observe them. Corals grow in layers, and those layers become a kind of record. Each band of calcium carbonate, each shift in growth direction, each slow expansion of a colony holds clues to centuries of changing water temperatures, storms, currents, and chemical conditions. The reef functions as a living timeline, storing information not in written form, but in the slow accumulation of mineral structures added tiny bit by tiny bit over decades and centuries. When a coral polyp grows, it deposits a thin layer of calcium carbonate beneath itself. When the next generation of polyps grows on top, it adds another layer. Over time, these layers stack, forming the skeleton that gives each coral its shape. Different species grow in different patterns. Some build tightly packed branching forms. Others create massive rounded structures that expand outward in steady increments. Regardless of their shape, the layers inside tell a similar story. They form annual bands much like rings in a tree. Researchers who study these layers can trace changes in the reef's history. They can determine when environmental conditions were stable, when temperatures fluctuated, when storms hit, and when periods of rapid growth or decline occurred. These growth layers reveal that the reef has endured countless cycles of environmental change. During periods when sea levels dropped, parts of the reef became exposed to air and died, only to be recolonized later when sea levels rose again. When temperatures shifted, growth slowed or sped up. When nutrient availability changed, the density of certain bands changed as well. Over long time scales, these changes form patterns. They show that the reef has adapted to ice ages, warm periods, shifting currents, and geological movements. One of the clearest pieces of evidence comes from massive corals that may live for centuries. These large colonies grow slowly but steadily, adding layers at a rate that can be measured. By examining these layers, researchers can determine how much the coral grew in a given year. Years with favourable conditions produce thicker growth bands. Years with stress produce thinner bands. Over centuries, this data forms a timeline of environmental conditions. In many cases, these timelines offer one of the most reliable long-term records of ocean temperature in the region. The reef's memory doesn't exist only inside corals. Old reef structures lying beneath the modern reef reveal earlier growth stages. As sea levels shifted over geological time, corals grew on top of older layers, creating terraces of ancient structures. Some of these layers are tens of thousands of years old. Researchers studying these deeper structures find patterns that show how the reef moved with the rise and fall of the ocean. When sea levels rose rapidly at the end of the last ice age, the reef kept up by growing vertically. When sea levels slowed, the reef expanded outward, forming the complex shapes seen today. The creatures living on the reef also contribute to its long-term memory. Shells accumulate in layers on the seafloor. The remains of sea urchins, snails, crustaceans, and other organisms settle into the sand. Over time, these remains become part of the geological record. By examining them, researchers can determine which species were present during different periods, how abundant they were, and how the community structure shifted. These patterns show how resilient the reef has been, but they also reveal periods when certain species disappeared or became scarce due to major environmental changes. The reef structure also stores chemical clues. Corals absorb different forms of oxygen and carbon from the water as they grow. The ratio of these isotopes inside coral skeletons tells scientists about past water temperatures and ocean chemistry. When temperatures were warmer, corals incorporated different proportions of isotopes than they did during cooler periods. This means coral skeletons hold a detailed chemical record of climate conditions that extend far beyond the reach of modern instruments. Much of what we know about the reef's earliest history comes from studying these chemical patterns. They show that the reef has expanded and contracted many times. During warm periods, coral growth was strong. During cooler periods, growth slowed. Storm events appear as disruptions in the layering. Major sediment disturbances leave traces in the chemical signature. These details help researchers understand how the reef's ecosystems changed and adapted. They reveal how quickly corals responded to environmental shifts and how long recovery took. When you look at the reef today, it can be easy to see only the living outer layer. But beneath every coral colony is a foundation built by generations before it. The deeper you look, the older those layers become. Some parts of the Great Barrier Reef rest on foundations formed thousands of years ago. In certain areas, modern corals grow on top of reefs that existed during earlier periods of sea level stability. When the ocean rose after the last ice age, some earlier reef structures drowned, but new corals settled on top, forming a continuous link between past and present. This long record also reveals how storms shaped the reef over time. After large storm events, layers of rubble settle in characteristic patterns. These patterns show that storms have always been part of the reef's environment. Periods of heavy storm activity leave more rubble deposits. Periods of relative calm leave cleaner layers. These records demonstrate that while storms can cause short-term damage, they have also contributed to shaping the reef structure. Coral fragments that break during storms often become the foundation for new colonies. This cycle of destruction and regrowth repeats across centuries. The reef's memory is not only geological but biological. Many species migrate seasonally, or respond to cycles that have existed for thousands of years. Fish follow temperature gradients. Plankton rise and fall with the light. Coral spawning occurs annually, based on cues that have been reliable throughout the reef's entire history. Even though conditions shift with each decade, the organisms continue following rhythms built on ancient patterns. One example of this long-term biological memory involves the spawning synchronized with lunar cycles. Even if the reef experiences a year of unusual temperatures or shifting currents, the timing still aligns with a pattern that has been followed for generations. These cues evolved through long periods of stability between the reef and the cycles of the moon. The reef's creatures depend on these signals because they have been reliable indicators for thousands of years, far longer than any human records of this region. The reef's memory also influences how it responds to environmental stress. Corals inherit traits from earlier generations that survived challenging conditions. Some corals tolerate heat better because their ancestors lived through warm periods. Others are more resistant to storms because their colonies formed in high-energy zones. These inherited adaptations contribute to the reef's ability to withstand modern challenges, even if the rate of change tests the limits of these long-developed traits. Over geological time, the reef has shifted location many times. As sea levels rose and fell, the entire system moved. During ice ages, sea levels dropped low enough that parts of the current reef were exposed to air and died. But when the sea returned, corals recolonized the area, forming new structures on top of older skeletons. These cycles show how dynamic the reef truly is. Even though it appears fixed in place, its long-term existence is defined by movement. The shape of the reef today reflects these movements. Ridges and channels formed because older reefs shaped the seabed. Over time, corals grew around these structures, creating new forms. In some areas, ancient river valleys filled with coral growth as the sea invaded them. These valleys remain part of the reef's underlying framework. In other areas, ridges formed where earlier reefs grew upward towards sunlight, then died when conditions changed. New corals grew over the remains, creating layered structures that reveal multiple generations of growth. Fish populations also leave long-term traces. Some species remain in the same regions for generations, following migration routes shaped by currents and temperature. These routes change slowly over time, driven by larger cycles in the ocean. As the reef structure changes, some species shift their territories. Others remain close to specific coral formations for centuries, because those areas consistently provide shelter or food. The reef's memory becomes most visible when comparing different regions. Some areas show rapid growth and recovery, indicating a history of stable conditions. Others reveal scars of past disturbance, long periods of slow growth, rubble from storms, or layers of dead coral beneath the living structures. These differences reflect how each section of the reef experienced past climate patterns, currents, and geological changes. Even the microscopic organisms carry this long-term history. Bacteria communities change depending on temperature, nutrient levels, and water chemistry. The types of bacteria found in older layers differ from those in modern layers. These changes reflect shifts in environmental conditions over centuries. By studying them, researchers learn how the reef responded to past warming events, cooling periods, and nutrient changes. The reef's long history also influences how vulnerable it is to modern disturbances. Some regions have survived repeated temperature fluctuations and intense storms over thousands of years. These areas tend to recover more quickly. Other regions have experienced long periods of stability and may be more sensitive to sudden changes. The reef is not a uniform system. Its many sections reflect different histories, shaped by local conditions, currents, and geological structures. Understanding the reef's past helps explain why it looks the way it does today. The towering coral bommies that rise from the seafloor formed through generations of growth layered on top of growth. The wide flat structures in shallower water were shaped by ancient reefs that grew during lower sea levels. The deep channels that cut between regions were carved by geological processes long before corals began growing there. The entire system is built on a shifting foundation created by both living organisms and natural forces. When you watch a coral colony expand outward year by year, it is easy to think of that growth as slow, but when you view the reef across centuries, the speed becomes impressive. Corals move upward or outward in ways that respond to sea level changes, light availability, and the shape of the surface beneath them. Over long periods, these small incremental shifts create large structures that define entire habitats. The reef's ability to store memory in stone-like structures gives it a continuity that stretches across eras. It has survived major shifts in climate, geological changes, storms, and variations in ocean currents. It has grown and regrown through cycles of destruction and renewal. Every fish that swims through its structures today moves through a landscape built by countless generations before it. Every coral polyp settling on a new surface builds on the work of those that came earlier. As the story continues, the final part brings this long timeline back into the present, connecting the reef's ancient memory with the lives that move through it today, and with the quiet sense of continuity carried by an ecosystem that has persisted through so many cycles of change while continuing to shape the world around it. When you've spent enough time wandering through the reef's routines, watching the animals move through their patterns, listening to the faint clicks, crackles, and steady rhythms that fill the water, something begins to shift in your sense of scale. What once looked like a busy, colourful landscape starts to feel more like an entire world with its own set of rules. The fish you've gotten used to seeing glide between coral branches start feeling familiar. The gentle rise of plankton during the twilight hours feels like a predictable part of the day. Even the shifting shadows cast by moving clouds overhead take on a certain reliability. You begin to notice small behaviours that went unseen earlier, slight changes in posture among fish when a larger predator passes, the way coral polyps retract as a shadow crosses over them, the moment when a shrimp pauses to assess a new piece of debris on the reef floor. The reef feels less like a place you are visiting, and more like a system that continues moving whether or not you're paying attention. When you reach the outer edge of the Great Barrier Reef, where coral structures begin giving way to deeper blue water, that sense of scale becomes even clearer. The reef doesn't end abruptly, it transitions. Coral formations lose some of their density. Fish communities change gradually. The shallow, sunlit areas give way to slopes that descend into deeper habitats where light fades quicker and currents move more freely. This boundary isn't a border in the usual sense. It's a region where the routines of the reef blend into the wider ocean. Here, the water feels different. The movements are slower but broader. The currents pull in long, sweeping motions influenced by tides, weather systems, and the shape of the seafloor. Schools of fish that stay tightly gathered in the central reef begin spreading into wider formations. The colours of the fish shift as well. Many species in this transitional zone display patterns suited for deeper water. Silvers, muted blues, or reflective scales that blend with the dim surroundings. Their behaviours change too. They rely less on quick darting movements between coral and more on steady swimming through open spaces. Large predators appear more frequently near this edge. Species like reef sharks patrol along these boundary zones, tracing paths shaped by both instinct and experience. They aren't here because the open water is easier to navigate. They're here because this region connects two worlds, the densely structured coral habitat and the expansive ocean beyond. Prey species travel along these edges, moving between feeding grounds and shelter. The predators follow these movements with measured timing. Their routines have adapted to the natural flow of traffic that passes through this transitional region. Coral structures still appear here, but they are spaced farther apart. Some rise from the seafloor like small towers, each one hosting its own community of fish, crustaceans and algae. Others form flat patches where corals grow low to the ground, shaped by waves that become stronger closer to the open ocean. The species that live in these corals are used to more variable conditions. They endure stronger currents, higher wave energy, and periodic shifts in visibility. Their routines accommodate these disruptions. Fish hide deeper within the coral during rough water and venture out when conditions calm. Invertebrates take advantage of strong currents to gather food delivered directly to their feeding structures. When you watch this area over the course of a day, the changes in light become more pronounced. Sunlight bends differently near the open water. The angle of the rays shifts depending on the time of day and weather patterns. As the sun moves, the reef casts long shadows into the blue. These shadows drift slowly, creating quiet pockets where fish gather for brief rest before moving on. Even small shifts in brightness influence how animals behave. Some species move closer to the reef when the light dims to avoid open water predators. Others take advantage of dimmer conditions to migrate between feeding areas. Farther out, larger fish occasionally appear in the distance. Some travel great distances between reefs. Others forage along the boundary, using the relative openness to spot prey from a distance. These movements are part of cycles that take place across broader areas of the ocean. They tie the Great Barrier Reef into a network of life that extends far beyond its visible structures. The slope leading down from the reef's edge supports creatures that rarely come into the shallow areas. Certain species of eels, larger rays and fish adapted to dim light inhabit these deeper zones. They rise toward the reef at night to feed, then return to deeper areas during the day where the water remains cooler and calmer. Their patterns link the shallow reef to the deeper ocean. The interaction between these zones ensures that nutrients, energy and life itself circulate across depths rather than remaining isolated in one layer. Sponges, soft corals and other filter feeders grow in abundance along these deeper slopes. They rely on the steady flow of water to deliver food. Their structures sway gently, moving with the current rather than resisting it. They provide habitat for small fish that remain close to their surfaces. These small fish benefit from the protection offered by the sponge's complex shapes, which create crevices and overhangs that deter predators. In return, the fish help control populations of tiny organisms that might harm the sponges. These interactions continue even in deeper areas where human eyes rarely reach. The outer edge of the reef is also where the impact of storms becomes most visible. Waves strike with the most force here. Coral formations near the surface may experience breakage during severe weather. But as you move slightly deeper, large coral structures reveal their long-term resilience. Their shapes have adapted to withstand this environment. They grow thicker, more compact, or closer to the sea floor. Their survival here speaks to the reef's ability to expand into areas that face harsh conditions, using different growth strategies depending on the challenges they encounter. When you look closely at these corals, small details reveal the history of storms that passed through years or decades before. Scars in the skeleton indicate where branches broke and regrew. Patterns in the growth layers show years when conditions were more favourable and years when they were less so. Each mark on the surface connects to a moment in the reef's long timeline, and together, these marks create the memory of storms the reef endured long before anyone observed them. Even the fish near the edge carry their own versions of memory. Some species revisit the same areas year after year. Others follow routes dictated by migrations that have remained stable for generations. Certain fish return to these boundary zones during specific seasons to feed, spawn, or seek shelter. They rely on cues that extend beyond individual lifetimes. Temperature changes, moon cycles, chemical signals in the water. The consistency of these cues over long periods has shaped patterns that continue today. At certain times of the year, large schools gather near the outer edge of the reef. These gatherings can be linked to spawning events, feeding opportunities, or seasonal migrations. The water becomes filled with coordinated movement as fish swim in unified formations that shift direction with remarkable precision. Their timing is influenced by long-term survival strategies shaped by the reef's history. Even in the open spaces near the reef's edge, these routines unfold quietly, following patterns that echo those of earlier generations. The deeper you move along the slope, the cooler the water becomes. Light fades into soft blue tones. Animals here rely more on sensory cues than on vision. Some species detect vibrations. Others rely on scent or electrical signals. Their interactions with the reef depend on these senses. They navigate through the dim environment with confidence shaped by instinct and experience. Their presence ties the shallow reef to the deep ocean, forming a connection that ensures nutrients and energy move across layers despite the differences in light and conditions. Over time, as you continue observing these transitions, the reef's breadth becomes more apparent. It stretches not only across thousands of kilometres but also across time. The living corals at the surface represent the most recent layer of a structure built by countless generations. Each ridge, slope, and terrace reflects a period when conditions favoured growth. Each valley or flattened section reflects a time when sea levels shifted or storms reshaped the terrain. The reef carries the memory of these changes in its structure, its communities, and the behaviours of its species. People often imagine the reef as something delicate, a place always on the edge of disruption. But spending time here shows that while the reef faces challenges, it also carries a remarkable degree of endurance. Its resilience does not come from being unchanging. It comes from its ability to adapt, rebuild, and continue forming new generations. When storms break coral branches, fragments reattach and form new colonies. When temperature changes stress some species, others step in to support the system. When sections of the reef decline, larvae from healthier regions drift in and recolonize. The reef responds to change through countless smaller adjustments, rather than a single dramatic shift. When you observe the reef from the edge, watching the water clear after a storm or the fish return after a moment of turbulence, You can see these small signs of resilience everywhere, in a broken coral fragment beginning to anchor itself, in a school of juvenile fish exploring a patch of seafloor newly cleared of algae, in the soft glow of plankton rising through the water column at dusk, in the way the reef soundscape gradually returns to its usual balance after a period of disturbance. The reef's continuity sits in these details. Its persistence is built on countless interactions playing out every hour across thousands of kilometres, each coral polyp depositing a thin layer of skeleton, each plankton cell dividing, each fish navigating a familiar route, each sponge filtering water that carries nutrients to other organisms. These small actions accumulate into something immense. They create a living structure large enough to be seen from space, yet held together by organisms so small they can pass unnoticed by human eyes. When you finally look back toward the shallow areas, where light dances more freely and fish weave between coral branches, the whole system feels connected. The hidden corridors shaped by small fish, the open slopes visited by larger predators, the deeper areas where animals move through dim water, the microscopic kingdoms that keep everything balanced, all of it forms a single, continuous place. The reef doesn't exist in separate layers, but in linked networks that depend on one another. Standing metaphorically at this edge, watching the reef continue its routines, you realise that it doesn't pause or wait. It keeps moving. The fish continue feeding. The corals continue building. The plankton continue drifting. The currents continue guiding everything quietly along paths carved by time. The reef doesn't need to announce its resilience. It shows it through steady persistence, through the way it absorbs change and keeps forming new life, through cycles that have repeated for thousands of years. Even as you step back from the edge in a figurative sense, the reef keeps going. It extends far beyond what you can see in any single moment. It stretches across distances, depths and timelines that all contribute to its identity. And while you carry an impression of this place with you, the reef continues unfolding its routines without interruption. The fish you watched earlier will move through the same paths tomorrow. The coral colonies will continue growing layer by layer. The deeper slopes will continue circulating nutrients between the reef and the open ocean. The Great Barrier Reef exists as a place built on continuity. It's shaped by every creature that lives within it, from the smallest microorganisms to the largest predators. It's influenced by storms, guided by seasons and recorded in layers of calcium carbonate. It's a living structure with a memory stretching back thousands of years, yet it renews itself every day through small, steady actions happening across its vast expanse. And even though you may only witness it for a moment, the reef continues moving forward, carrying its history in its structure and its future in the lives that drift, swim, build, and grow across its living surface.